Okay, Wendy.
Do we want to wait another minute or should we begin? But it will begin in a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Wendy Permit, and on behalf of the Center for Health Policy and Law and Northeastern University School of Law, I want to welcome all of you to our annual spring conference, which is being held on a very snowy April day in Boston. And I want to give a big shout out to Jennifer Ewer, our tireless and talented executive director, who is without question the magician behind this conference and all of our events, and will be behind the 44th Annual Health Law Professors Conference that we will be hosting with the American Society of Law, Medicine, and Ethics starting on June 7th. I hope that all of you will join us for 4 days of scholarship and socializing. I also want to thank my colleague, Jonathan Kahn, who you'll be meeting later this afternoon, who has been a true partner and colleague every step of the way in organizing and planning this event. Many thanks also to the students of the Northeastern University Law Review, who have partnered with us once again this year in issuing a call for papers and in hosting this event, and they will be publishing several of the papers that you'll hear about today. I also want to thank Dr. Alfredo Moravia and the American Journal of Public Health. It has been my great privilege these past 2 years to work with him and the journal, and I'm excited to hear his panel on the fascist threat to public health, a topic that the journal has taken a leadership role in discussing. Unfortunately, the topic of this year's conference, the body politic, undermining democracy, undermining health, could not be more timely. Over the past year, we have lived through a pandemic that has killed over 500,000 Americans, far too many of whom have been Black and brown. Globally, almost 3 million people have died. In the US, we have also lived through a bitterly disputed election, the big lie, and an insurrection on our Capitol. We have witnessed too many young Black men and women dying at the hands of police officers, too much anti-Asian hate, and too many mass shootings. We have seen states across the nation rush to restrict voting rights, even as they are also rushing to reduce public health powers and prevent public health officials from addressing the next health crisis. In both cases, they have done so cheered on by many courts. Anti-vaccination misinformation is proliferating, and fights over masking continue 14 months into the pandemic in the US. And around the world, authoritarianism seems to be on the march as strong men who underplay the pandemic and advance conspiracy theories to cling to power. Not for generations has democracy and public health seemed so imperiled. And in no time has health and democracy seemed so intertwined. The papers and panels today will explore these intersected themes, highlighting different aspects of a complex and multifaceted problem, and hopefully offering at least some glimpses of a way forward. I am excited to be part of this event and look forward to hearing today from all of our authors, commentators, and panelists, as well as hearing from your questions and comments in the time that will be set aside for Q&A. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Andrew Farrington, Northeastern University School of Law class of 2021, and the editor-in-chief of the Northeastern Law Review, who will introduce the first panel.
Thank you, Professor Parmet, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Professor Parmet said, my name is Andrew Farrington, and I am a third-year law student at Northeastern, and I serve as a co-editor-in-chief of the Northeastern University Law Review. I'd like to begin my welcome by thanking Director Hewer and the Northeastern Law Center for Health Policy and Law for collaborating with the Law Review and for providing the opportunity for me and my fellow Law Review members to be here today. For those of you who might not know, the Northeastern University Law Review is a student-run academic journal. Our journal is comprised of approximately 130 student editors, and we publish on 3 different platforms. Our main platform is a print publication in which we publish 2 issues each academic year. Our other 2 platforms are online publications. One is Extra Legal, which publishes articles similar to the length of our print articles, and the other is The Forum, which is a blog-style publication. The one thing all of our 3 platforms have in common is that we tend to solicit and publish scholarship that focuses on the intersection of the law and the public interest. This focus on issues at the intersection of law and the public interest has led to ongoing collaborations with the Center for Health Law and Policy. The center's efforts to inform real-world policy decisions that strengthen population health, reduce health disparities, and improve access to high-quality, affordable health care aligns with the Law Review's social justice mission and makes them a natural partner. Most recently, we collaborated with the Center for Health Law and Policy at our annual Law Review Symposium, entitled The Many Faces of Health, a symposium focusing on the many legal and social issues stemming from the pandemic. I am incredibly proud to be here representing the Law Review in our 4th year of partnership on the Center's annual Health Law Conference. This year, we're delighted to be publishing works by conference participants Ala Haas, Paula Sepulveda Miranda, Sonia Fernandez Quinones, and Courtney Anderson in our spring issues, Volume 14, Issue 1. We are incredibly excited to work with you over the coming months and are looking forward to helping you create a wonderful final article. In the spirit of our ongoing collaboration, the Law Review will be assisting and facilitating today's conference. Along with providing the portion of today's welcome address, I will also introduce each workshop and the speaker and commentator pairs before they speak. Additionally, several Law Review members are in attendance today, and they will be posting on our various social media platforms highlights from this workshop. I know we are all looking forward to the start of these workshops, so on a final note, I would like to cover a quick logistical point. Many of you will likely have questions for the speakers during this workshop. We welcome them, so please feel free to post your questions in the chat. You may also feel free to save your questions for the end of the workshop because there will be a Q&A session at the end. So without further ado, we will now begin the paper workshop with our first set of speakers. I would like to introduce the first author and commentator pairing. The author is Professor Courtney Anderson, Associate Professor of Law at the Georgia State University College of Law. And our commentator will be Dorian Mason, who is the Director of Health Equity at the National Women's Law Center.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you to Jennifer and everyone else who helped put this event together. I'm so excited to be a part of it. I just have some slides, so I'll just take a moment to share my screen and then I will get started. And I'm really excited that Dorian will have the opportunity to give me some feedback, and I look forward to everyone's comments and questions at the conclusion of the workshop. So I'm an associate professor at Georgia State University College of Law, and I focus in health equity. And I was so excited that the law reviews were doing this topic, because for a while I had been thinking about the impact of protesting on public health. And just with the culmination of everything that's gone on, during the pandemic, I feel like this issue is really important. And what I'd love, especially your thoughts and feedback on, are kind of what to do with my thought that public and individual health is intrinsic to protesting and adversely impacting these people who are advocating for change. So I think it's a really good point to talk about what we can do in the Medicaid realm. And I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on other uses for this information. So I'll just start by saying, of course, we know that protests are usually organized, mobilized, and amplified by these parties for whom the change is sought. And specifically, I'm going to speak about women and people of color. So of course, we know about women marching for reproductive rights, women marching against misogyny, and for the right to vote, Black people organizing to lead demonstrations against police brutality, and also to bring awareness about racism. And so throughout the process of fighting for this comprehensive change, the activists rarely have the time nor the space to really think about how to properly care for their own health and well-being, and how their actions might be contrary to their own health, though they're advocating for a greater good. And so although being entrenched in a fight that they believe in, that's for the well-being of others and with those whom they identify, that can obviously provide a positive mood change, but still these activists suffer from mental and physical health complications as a direct result of being exposed to stress. So what I'll do is kind of give an overview of women's rights and civil rights and some of these protests, and talk specifically about the intersection between racism and health. Violent and racist incidents reproduce horrifying images and also cause communities of color to relive this trauma while championing their cause. So due to the urgent nature of these protests, rare that advocates have the luxury of considering the long-term health effects of their actions, or that they're able to incorporate any type of health-related protections in their demands. They're really just kind of focused on the cause. And so I think if we take a look to see how legislators, politicians, and other leaders can really recognize the validity of the cause and take advantage of the opportunity to support the movement. If they're doing this, then they should likewise support those who sacrifice their health and put themselves in harm's way to initiate and to advance these causes. And so just starting with the women's rights protest, just to give an overview, as I'm sure you know, women's rights were born in this time riddled with prejudice and suppression. So many women wanted change and to have their thoughts and opinions just weighed equally with men. And so we start with the National American Women's Suffrage Association, formed in 1912, formed to perfect the passage of the federal amendment for the women's right to vote. This preceded the National Women's Party, which really was effective in pressuring Congress and state legislatures to support the 19th Amendment. And they also put adequate pressure on President Woodrow Wilson at the time. And so, again, we see this kind of confusion around movements when you have the intersectionality of women and also race. So some suffragists' first concern was how to get the women's right to vote, at the expense of Black men, which was the 15th Amendment, and also how to get white women's votes was more important than getting Black women's votes. And so there was a lot of bifurcation and racism within this movement that was effective in getting the women's rights to vote, but though at the expense of other women. And so it was a sort of a racially charged movement that in theory was for all women, but as long as white women have the right to vote, Black men did not have this supposed power over white women. And so Alice Paul, who planned the march in 1913 in Washington, D.C., her primary concern was that white women would not come to the parade if they had to march next to Black women. And so that's when we started to see a lot of segregation in the parades, and arguably a lot of issues began then with respect to mental and physical health that I'll highlight again when we get to more recent protests. And also in the context of the 15th Amendment being passed, giving Black men the right to vote, we still saw a lot of lynchings, and there wasn't the support from white suffragists who were on the ground advocating for progressive change to advocate against racism in this context. So they weren't advocating for the end of lynching because protecting the white women's virtue was often an excuse for lynching, and they didn't want to conflate their cause by sort of speaking out against this practice of lynching. And more recently, we see, the March on Washington when on the first day of Donald Trump's presidency in January 21st, 2017, when thousands of people descended in Washington for the Women's March on Washington. And not just in that city, but around the globe, we saw millions of people in their own respective marches in solidarity with this cause. So in DC alone, there are over 500,000 people who marched. And in the US total, there are about 4.1 million who marched in their respective cities, with more people around the world. And kind of looking at the civil rights protests, we saw the same momentum and energy born in 1955, really sparked initially by Rosa Parks and the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which was this 13-month mass protest that ended with the Supreme Court ruling that segregations on public buses is unconstitutional. And then we moved forward with also looking at statutes and ordinances requiring segregation of white races from Black races on buses in Montgomery, and looking at the police jurisdiction, how this violates due process. So, once we decided that this was unconstitutional pursuant to the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, we still had a long way to go. So we had in 1963, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was one of the largest political rallies ever seen in the US, drawing over 200,000 people. This, of course, is where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech on the Lincoln Memorial. But at the time, when we're looking at the public response, 60% of people polled felt unfavorably about this march. So although these people successfully advocated for change, they're doing so against a lot of public and societal resistance, not to mention, of course, the obvious police and military force that they had to face. So just trying to understand how, when we pass these bills, which I'll speak about in a moment, nothing acknowledging the health or this type of sacrifice was really at the forefront. So the following August, when Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, along with the Civil Rights Act, where we saw the Fair Housing Act and all types of sort of responses to the assassination of Martin Luther King and the responses to all of these protests, we saw the most expansive legislation with respect to civil rights at this time. And so the Voting Rights Act at the time greatly reduced the disparity between Black and white voters and allowed a greater number of African Americans to participate in politics and also just government generally. With the Fair Housing Act, we saw the prohibition of racism and discrimination in renting, financing, and acquiring property, with this separate clause to affirmatively further fair housing. But none of these laws and policies reduce the need for this on-the-ground grassroots activism that we're still seeing today. And sort of the health of the advocates were not considered or incorporated into any of this legislation. And so moving forward in the 1960s, we saw continued activism by the Black Panthers and other organizations challenging police brutality. As the Black Panthers grew in size and grew in influence and grew their presence, they opened branches in several cities, over 5,000 members in 49 chapters by 1969. And so as protests progressed and became more popular during the 1960s, the negative reactions stemming from the protests and painting these protesters as violent and as the enemy, anti-American, anti-patriotic, also had an uptick at this time. And this continues today. If you just look from 2013, where Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi created the Black Lives Matter movement, we saw the nationalization of the movement driven by the Michael Brown murder and the murder of Trayvon Martin. And then, as I mentioned, just this past summer, we saw more nationwide protests during the pandemic with the murder of George Floyd on Memorial Day of 2020. So the popularization and the more proliferation of these images of unarmed Black men being murdered, unarmed Black women being murdered, for misdemeanors at the most, and nothing, with no other kind of justification for any type of police presence, let alone police drawing their weapons, really kind of triggered a lot of protests. And just recently, of course, we've seen the incidences with respect to Dwayne Wright being murdered and Adam Toledo also striking protests. And the response has really been if you compare the response to these protests today with the responses during the Civil Rights Act, as Professor Parmet talked about, what's going on with what legislators are doing. So she mentioned the Voting Rights Act, which is also kind of in light of this increased presence with respect to protests against police brutality. And we've also seen legislators in 40 plus states proposing several bills to abridge the right of peaceful assembly, and have justified this as a necessary precaution against organizations, specifically Black Lives Matter and similar movements. With the election year of 2020, we saw several bills that were making it very difficult to vote, very difficult to register to vote, or even to wait in line to vote. And so this has been the response to the protesters, again, really concentrated at communities of color, causing further oppression without any respect to mental health. And there is a really strong connection between activism and mental health. So there are a lot of studies that have been done to see how engaging in this type of social activism affects health on the individual level. And they can really exacerbate poor health outcomes that already exist due to racial disparities of health, which I'll mention in a moment. But when we think about what people are dealing with when they're engaged in activism, when they're engaged in protests, and by activism, I mean obviously protests, but even just being a part of the community where all of these atrocities, specifically with police brutality, are committed against, you're exposed to stress, you're exposed to trauma and images over and over again, which has negative effects on mental and physical health. Of course, when you're physically in danger, physically on the field, police use physical force much more often when encountering Black protesters compared to white protesters. Police officers associate Black people with criminal conduct and violence, which affects their response to this population. And individuals who experience physical assault or violence are more prone to post-traumatic stress syndrome, depression, and even physical symptoms as a result of this traumatic experience. So one study gauging the mental and physical symptoms of women who had been the subject of physical assault, community violence, or intimate partner violence were found to be prone to PTSD, depression, anxiety, and much more prone to other chronic illnesses. And this specified that a majority of women who experience physical violence are also in a state of being constantly berated, socially isolated, and dehumanized, which can really exacerbate these negative health outcomes. And again, even when people of color are not the express victims of physical violence, their health suffers. And this concept of what's called compassion fatigue is when people experience stress and trauma when they're exposed to the suffering of others and identify with that stress. Compromised immune systems and heart health also result from stress, which has been shown to accelerate cellular aging. It can wear down the body systems and generally produce a variety of illnesses and premature mortality. Stress from racial discrimination, which was recently recognized as a CDC as a very lead indicator of health disparities, is particularly harmful. So we see African Americans, Native Americans, Latin Americans who have been impacted greatly by hypertension and diabetes due to chronic stress resulting from discrimination. And with the rise of hatred and domestic terrorism against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, these groups are also reporting increased incidences of mental and physical health and are still kind of on the ground with respect to responding to this type of trauma and also leading efforts for change against this type of trauma while they're being traumatized. And not only does racism cause health problems, but it's also an obstacle to receiving optimal health care for people of color. So when you look at discrimination within the healthcare system, it often happens when there's a lack of cultural competency, when there's explicit or implicit racial bias on the part of the medical professional, which is exacerbating the health outcomes and general access to health. So these people who are victims of such prejudice can be misdiagnosed, they can receive inappropriate treatment, or even worse, just generally refuse to seek health care. And so all of these different types of discriminations that are within the health care system itself makes it difficult to really pinpoint where we should start with the change, because it's not just a matter of increasing access, but really looking at the underlying systemic factors that are creating this prejudice. And when we speak about health disparities, there are several definitions. One working definition that I tend to rely on are these preventable differences in the burden of disease and also the opportunities to achieve optimal health experience by socially disadvantaged populations. And when you put this in the context of activism, you're adding the additional obligation for people to be responding and creating these types of changes themselves without getting the appropriate health care. So some examples of health disparities, when you're looking at people from socioeconomic perspectives, lower income people have disproportionately high rates of obesity, asthma, and other illnesses. And when we look at the infant mortality gap between white and African Americans, it continues to grow in 2021, even compared to 1950. And the real key with health disparities, and one of the reasons that despite all of the negative things that I've been talking about, that there is some hope, is that these differences are preventable. So I do think that there's an opportunity to change some of these horrifying statistics that put people of color, that put women at a much lower chance to achieve optimal health outcomes than other people. These are just some more statistics that really highlight health disparities. And when you're looking at the groups, all of these factors account for income when we're just talking about race. So there's no other explanation other than systemic racism, which again has been recently recognized by other leading medical organizations. And just highlighting the reason for some of these disparities, when you look at even medical documents, textbooks that medical professionals use to teach their profession, we see that, they have really stereotypical, incorrect information about, Asians might not like having their blood drawn. And so students should focus on communicating non-verbally when their patients are African American for fear that they might understand or not be interested in the medical terms. These stereotypes that have existed since slavery, that Black people can't feel pain or have thicker skin, and so they're prescribed pain medication at less frequent rates, or they may more likely to be drug abusers. And so all of these stereotypes that are baked into the learning process just exacerbate these health disparities. So all of this is sort of despite insurance. And so when I was thinking about, what do we do with this information, knowing that people who advocate for change suffer from mental health and for physical health, it really just can't be relegated to the insurance realm, but kind of has to move beyond to see what laws and policies can do to address some of these underlying factors, and perhaps how Medicaid can be used to create more preventative measures rather than just focusing on the healthcare system itself. And so when we look at where Medicaid exists to provide extra health care for citizens, since they have the option, states have the option whether or not to expand, and this changes regularly. But the most recent information, looking at the states who have not expanded Medicaid, we also see an overlap of a lot of these states that have significant police brutality instances and a lot of these states that have restricted voting laws. As I mentioned, I live in Georgia. We have one of the most restrictive voting laws that was recently passed. A lot of incidences of police brutality highlighted with the George Floyd incident last year, a lot of protests, and also our healthcare system has not reached the people who it needs to reach, and we've declined to expand Medicaid. So you can see how a lot of these factors reverberate, and activism is just another argument that we can use when we're arguing for Medicaid expansion, the use of Medicaid and healthcare funds to address some of these underlying issues that these communities face when they're trying to just achieve their optimal healthcare solutions. So I definitely look forward to your comments and to your questions about my paper, and really appreciate the opportunity to share this topic with you. Thank you.
So are we going straight into my section? I wasn't sure. Okay. So I just wanted to first say thank you so much to Northeastern University School of Law. Thank you to Jennifer, and of course, thank you to Courtney. Just a brief piece of information about sort of who I am and the organization that I'm here representing. I'm Dorian Mason, an attorney, director of health equity at the National Women's Law Center. We are an organization that fights for gender justice across the multiple areas of women's lives. So employment, opportunities, employment justice, health justice, reproductive justice, all of these areas that touch a woman's life, we are working in those spheres. And so it is really exciting to be able to take a look at this draft, particularly because a significant portion of the work that I do is to try to make legislators understand that health extends beyond just coverage and extends even beyond just quality of care. Those are two ways for us to measure it, but really when we're talking about both individual health and community health, we have to look at all these other aspects and areas of a person's life. And so here, when we're taking a look at the role that activism plays in either bringing someone closer or pushing them further away from good health, that is an example of really the more expansive view of health that legislators do in fact need to know and to hear. So I was really excited to be able to have this paper as an example of that. So thank you for your contribution to that, to the field of health equity. So I am somebody who went to law school mostly because I loved history. And of course, when you dig into history, particularly chattel slavery and the centuries that followed and the vestiges of chattel slavery here in the United States, you realize that the law is obviously a tool, many times, unfortunately, a tool of oppression. And as you stated in your paper, a tool that operates to maintain the status quo and minimize the degree of change driven by either a thesis or antithesis at any given time. And I think your paper does a wonderful job demonstrating the harm that can occur because of that, harm not just to our individual rights, right? The people who are fighting and being activists and really actively engaged in the fights, but also to the physical and mental health of those individuals who are fighting the injustices of the status quo. I appreciated your compendium of the women's rights movement. I felt myself, though, coming back to a title of this Black women's rights reader. All women are white, all Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that title, but that is what I kept coming back to when I was reading through this paper. For me, it is really important that when you're breaking out the history of the women's suffrage movement at the front of the paper, that maybe it's an opportunity to, rather than have the portion talk about race at the end of that section, to actually incorporate it throughout, because I feel like that bifurcation actually takes away from what a significant role race did play in the women's suffrage movement, particularly if we're talking about the famous white suffragettes and Frederick Douglass and their dynamic relationship, the creation and dissolution of the AERA, the regulation of Black women in these spaces, particularly when we're talking about the marches. And I'll say particularly the 1913 March, where that was the first official act of the sorority that I'm in, which is really significant. So all that to say is that the role that Black women played at every stage of the women's suffragette movement, I think that it both represents sort of the substantive ask of the movement, but also sort of the figurative population that many times is left behind. And I think that by incorporating those sort of intersections of race and gender within the setting out of the history versus at the end, I think that would come through in a really powerful way. And of course, you have all that substance. You really do. It's all just in that second section. And I think that there's also an opportunity to really focus on the concrete harms to women of color, particularly if we're talking about the suffragette movement, Black women, and to talk about sort of incorporate some of the health disparities that were occurring even then, that are unique to the stress that being both subject to gender discrimination and subject to racial discrimination really cause. So I know you know this, the issues of race and gender are very intertwined, and I think that we should see that in the text of that sort of setting out of the historical context for the suffragettes. I would also say that there's room to explore how that same tension manifested in even the current women's rights marches. That's something that I know of personally, but I didn't necessarily see reflected in the draft of the paper. And that's also sort of an opportunity to say that this is something not only that is historical, but is obviously continuing to this day, that unfortunate artificial tension between gender and racial justice. So I think that's an opportunity for you to uplift that. So I also really appreciated the discussion that you have of the use of law and police to silence dissension, particularly in the civil rights section. I think the framing of the proliferation of laws restricting movement and lives for under-resourced communities was really good. I would also, though, caution that language is important, and particularly when you're talking about the White Citizens Council, you describe them as a group that opposed racial segregation, but they were really instead white supremacists that were also domestic terrorists. And I think that it's really important in literature to name things as they are. And so particularly because in a separate section, when you're talking about the Black Power movement, you describe them as militant. So I think it's important that we are very precise in our language, and particularly when we are naming domestic terrorism that is really the root of the American existence. So also in the discussion of 1967 Detroit Rebellion causes, you listed racism really as a cause and then listed out these other factors. When we get down to it, all of those other things that are listed are really, racism is the root of those things. When we're talking about, extreme levels of poverty, when we're talking about unemployment and underemployment, when we're talking about educational opportunities, particularly for Black people in America, the basis is racism, not necessarily racism as a listed cause in addition to those things. And that's the same as when we're talking about public health, right? There is a frame now that's being talked about pretty widely that says it's racism, not race. And so when we're talking about public health disparities and individual health disparities with outcomes, that it's important to name that racism really is at the root and not just a factor. And then, let's see. I would also say that it was really interesting to see your use pretty consistently throughout of highlighting the role of media, because that is so important, particularly as it relates to the most recent Black Lives Matter sort of influx of new activism around what the social media has really allowed us to see that otherwise we wouldn't necessarily have seen. And so I would love to hear or have that developed a little bit more as it relates to sort of a theme that is consistent through both the suffragette movement and the civil rights movement, and then the current Black Lives Matter movement. And then the last thing that I noted is that, you talk about pretty consistently police as a part of all of these things, police role in the suffragette movement, police role in the civil rights movement, and then police role in the Black Lives Matter movement. So another part of my work is that I came from the criminal legal system world. So before I came to the National Women's Law Center, I worked for years on criminal legal system reform. And I think that there is a part of policing that is unstated, that really, it's not just about the oppressive nature of policing in America for Black and brown communities, under-resourced communities. It's also that the police force is really representative of something bigger than just the police force. It's representative of a government who is intentionally divesting from communities, a government that is intentionally stereotyping and oppressing communities. And there is something, I think, that goes to what you outlined on the first page when you had that line about the law, that a very strong and concrete connection between the law sort of preserving the status quo and the police being the arm of that, the police being sort of the manifestation of that desire to keep things as they are. And I think that would be something really interesting to flesh out more as you develop the paper. other than that, I thought it was wonderful. So thank you so much for allowing me to take a look at it and provide feedback.
Thank you so much for your feedback. I think we're over time, so I won't be long, but I was trying to type notes while you were talking. If you wrote any notes, I'd be happy to take a look at anything you may have written. I think I got everything, but just in case, thank you, Dorian.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor Anderson and Attorney Mason, for your thoughts. And up next, I would like to introduce our next author, Professor Ayla Haas, who is an assistant professor of law at the University of Tulsa College of Law. And the commentator will be Dr. Mary Owen, who is the director at the Center of American Indian and Minority Health at the University of Minnesota Medical School.
Great. Thank you so much for the warm welcome. And I'm delighted to be able to join you from Tulsa, which is within the reservation boundaries of the Muskogee Creek Nation. I know we can't be together physically right now, but I wanted to give you a little bit of Tulsa for me today, which is very rainy and thundery, so much so that my pup Neville did not want me to leave the house. So I took him to daycare instead. I think it's important as a non-native researcher, I'm Iranian American, that I start off by acknowledging that everything I've learned about Indigenous health and tribal sovereignty has been through tribal public health practitioners, leaders, advocates, and scholars, including folks like Dr. Mary Owen. And I also think it's incredibly important as I talk about issues like structural violence and racism, anti-tribal sovereignty, that I am forthcoming with the fact that I am a researcher of part of a large academic institution and am at risk of perpetuating the same violence, biases, and other harms. Of course, my goal is that I can be an ally and advocate, but regardless, my work is informed by the great leadership that's coming out of Indian country, with my sincere thanks. It's really hard for me to talk about my research sometimes because not everyone has a lot of familiarity with tribal governments and federal Indian law. And I think that is a critique and result of our education system and how racism manifests in multiple forms. And while I'm sure you all are very familiar, I want to just offer a little bit of background and a reminder that Indigenous communities have been living and caring for and governing on the lands that we now call the United States since time immemorial. The federal government recognizes the sovereign status of 574 federally recognized tribes, but as is everything related to federal Indian law, that in itself has roots in racism and politics. And just because the federal government recognizes some tribes and not others is not necessarily indicative of that tribe's long history of governance and sovereignty. As sovereign nations, tribes have a government-to-government relationship, both with the state and the federal government, and at the federal level, that's going to be a nation-to-nation relationship. And tribes, as sovereigns, have jurisdiction over their land and their people. They pass laws, they have governments, leadership, judiciaries, and governance is going to be reflective of each tribe's unique histories, communities, cultures. Now, federal Indian law is the body of law that governs the relationship between three sovereigns: tribes, states, and the federal government. Make no mistake, the foundational doctrines of federal Indian law are based on and legalized colonization and genocide of Indigenous peoples. These doctrines continue to apply today. And while the federal government has not used its authority under this framework of law to perpetuate the same types of harms that it might have in the context of boarding school, military attacks. We see that modern day colonization implemented in other ways, which I'll talk about. Tribes are sovereign nations. They have jurisdiction over their lands and people, but in practice, federal law, essentially the conditioning of federal recognition of tribal sovereignty, has meant that the federal government has created a very complex web of jurisdiction when we're talking about authority in criminal law or civil law. and that can vary substantially. One important piece of federal Indian law that's incredibly important, and many Indian law scholars I would say should not exist, is the doctrine of plenary power, where the Supreme Court has held that Congress has complete authority to legislate on all matters concerning tribes and Indians. And so what that means in practice is that even though tribes are sovereigns, and even though they have treaties with the federal government, that the Supreme Court has interpreted this Congress's plenary power to mean that Congress can legally abrogate rights that are outlined in treaties. And that's incredibly important. Now, understanding that law comes from many places, that's going to be the same for federal Indian law, whether it's principles of international law and doctrine of discovery, whether it's US Constitution, or whether it's our three branches and our executive agencies. Every single source of law in the United States touches and impacts the rights of American Indians, Alaska Natives, and tribes. And we're going to talk about that more in terms of implications for consultation. It's also really important to get an understanding of federal Indian health systems. So the federal government, as part of treaty obligations, remember the Constitution says that treaties are the supreme law of the land, that the federal government is going to provide health care to tribes in exchange for territories that tribes had ceded, or, again, historically stolen. But that's neither here nor there. Federal Indian law recognizes certain narratives and histories regarding to law. Federal legislation reaffirms commitments to provide healthcare that are found in treaties through a variety of different statutes. Most importantly, it's the Snyder Act and the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. And federal law, the Supreme Court, Congress have all recognized a legal doctrine called the trust responsibility. And what the trust responsibility does is it recognizes that the federal government has an incredibly important role in light of history and treaty and trust obligations to protect tribal treaty rights, their lands, their resources, carrying out the duties and mandates of federal Indian law. Trust responsibility is often described as both a moral and fiduciary obligation to protect trust assets like funds in a bank account or trust lands. And while this is not necessarily the scope within my scope of the presentation, just raise your hand if you think the federal government has done a great job in terms of protecting trust assets, because the answer is no. So when we think about the legal obligation to provide health care, I often share a funny cartoon and a recent meme about the quality of care that the federal government has provided through Indian Health Service. And while it is funny and it's great to be able to incorporate a Bernie Sanders meme when we're talking about having to wait too long at IHS, in practice, it's incredibly remarkably sad that healthcare legal obligations to provide healthcare have not been honored. Now, even though the federal government provides and is legally required to provide healthcare in Indian country, that does not mean that is the sole health system that's supporting Indian country. We have tribal 638 facilities that, with federal funding and under protections and contracts for the federal government, take funds that otherwise would have gone to IHS and invest them in their own communities in a way that they see as most appropriate. And those tribally run, federally funded facilities have seen nothing but incredible success as compared to direct care offered through Indian Health Service. And as we think about where American Indians and Alaska Natives live and seek care, we're also going to know that local and state health departments and private providers and employers providing insurance are all also going to have an impact on tribal health systems. But I will say, although I will repeatedly talk about the failings of the federal government in honoring their legal obligations to provide health care, we don't talk enough about tribes mitigating federal failures through the exercise of their sovereignty and promoting community and culture as indispensable tools. And one of the ways that we continue to see this, that we've been able to see this especially, has been throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm so delighted, although not surprised, that tribal vaccination programs have gotten so much media attention. It's well deserved, although a little late. I'm not Native. I can't speak to individual tribal cultures related to Indigenous health and healing, but I think it's also important as we frame responsibilities under federal law to provide healthcare in the context of what health is. And while no tribe or community or culture is universal, I do feel comfortable saying that on balance, Indigenous cultures view health more completely and more expansively than our Western American model. So incorporating emotional and spiritual and environmental health and well-being as part of both an individual and community wellness. So already when we frame the federal requirements for healthcare, we are going to be seeing the perpetuation of health in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect their own communities. 1928, the federal government commissioned a report to find out what's going on in Indian country. And unsurprisingly, a lot of the report that's called today the Merriam Report discussed the atrocious health facilities, limited health access, health disparities that should not have existed in Indian country, period, but especially in light of the treaty obligations to provide healthcare. We don't have time, but some of the quotes from that report, again, a report from 1928, will just make you cry just thinking about it. And then you fast forward to 2018, federal government, U.S. Commission on Civil Rights commissioned a report on broken promises, a substantial chapter being on healthcare. And it's like you're reading the same report. Not enough facilities, inadequate quality of care. The federal government is not providing sufficient funds to meet their legal obligations. So then if it's under the law, why is that? And it gets to this big underlying issue of an inability to adequately enforce legal provisions as they relate to the rights of tribes and American Indians, Alaska Natives. Just a couple of cases that I make my students read in my American Indian Health Law class, but they are so many more. One from the Supreme Court, 1993, where the court says, well, federal agencies have discretion. This is administrative law. They get to choose where the facilities are going to be located and how much they're going to fund and allocate. Another case, although I could have plucked, there's dozens and dozens of them, another case that was recently argued at the federal circuit level just a few weeks ago, of where again, a health facility, in this particular case, an emergency department, was providing such a terrible standard of care that it had to shut down, that it was not a safe place to get even emergency care. So, not legally enforceable, lots of discretion. As long as they're providing some funding, it's okay if it's inadequate, and even okay if you can't even support the having an emergency department. Is that meeting a moral responsibility? And the courts will say moral responsibility is not something that's enforceable. We can only enforce fiduciary obligations. So what does this have to do with consultation? Consultation foundation is on this trust responsibility, acknowledging the unique relationship between tribes and the federal government. It's a government-to-government process that allows tribes to evaluate policies prior to the policy being enacted so they can have a voice in the soundness of the policy, in the scope of the policy, in the application of the policy. Consultation is supposed to be meaningful. It's supposed to be free, occur prior to a policy being made, and informed. Engagement, although incredibly important as well, is one type of consultation, but every kind of engagement with tribes, like surveys or an advisory committee meeting or informal communications through tribal leader letters, those are not the same thing as consultation. Consultation is a specific process outlined under the law. And we've got requirements for them, although I put them in quotes because what's a requirement without a proper enforcement mechanism? We've got presidential actions requiring consultation for all federal executive agencies. We've got select federal legislation, like the National Environmental Policy Act, Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act, among others that require consultation. We've got a UN declaration that is not legally binding, talking about the importance of consultation. And then we have some states that have implemented select consultation requirements at state level or through intergovernmental agreements. The big consultation mandate folks talk about is Executive Order 13175. And very conveniently, although it talks about agencies having to consult with tribes before taking action, very last section 10 of the executive order states that the order is intended to improve internal management, but not intended to create a right, benefit, or trust responsibility, nothing enforceable by law. Federal legislative mandates, like under the National Historic Preservation Act, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, and others, do have some teeth in them. And the remedies available are going to be invalidating federal agency action or delaying actions and necessitating some sort of litigation. So what happens then if these federal legislative mandates aren't within the scope of the health policy issue that's going to be consulted on? Only the ones that overlap in those areas are going to be enforceable. And why is this a ginormous problem? Because there's no racial ethnic group whose rights are more heavily regulated than American Indians and Alaska Native. Just under federal statutory law, over 80 different definitions of who is going to be an Indian under that particular context. And so you have courts and the legislature and federal agencies having the absurd authority to determine who is an Indian and whether a certain tribe's cultural practices are worthy of constitutional religious freedom protections, or whether the land that a tribe has protected since time immemorial is going to have access to even walk on, use, or support that land. And what does Native representation look like in our executive branch, our legislature, and our judicial branches and agencies? Well, I'm all with everyone super excited about Secretary Holland's confirmation as Secretary of the Department of Interior. That is not enough. You have non-Native people determining the scope of rights. And non-Native people, given the full breadth of laws that implicate tribes, American Indians, Alaska Natives, doing the consultation. Consultation, over and over again, we have heard that it is not effective, that federal agencies, if they bother showing up, have already made decisions, that they're not done in good faith. Instances of what I've called outsourcing to third parties and letting folks who've applied for a permit for extraction or for pipeline development to consult with tribes and letting that be legally protectable. It's not enough. And this has health impacts, both because federal laws that allowed for Indian boarding schools and harmful assimilation policies and relocation policies have led to atrocious health outcomes when we're thinking about historical trauma, adverse childhood experiences. That's well documented. But also because there's a ginormous breadth of health policies that don't have adequate consultation and have no proper enforcement mechanism. So my proposal in this article is that we need legislation on Indian health policy that has teeth to it in the way the executive order is never going to be able to fill, and that it should include actually having funding attached to it so that tribes don't have to spend so many resources and staffing in order to try to know every single potential federal agency policy that's going to be implicated. And in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, there might be a greater desire to improve relationships between tribes, states, and the federal government. This isn't going to fix tribal federal relations. And I've been struck by a quote from some local activist here that said, until we are seen as equals, consultation is never going to produce the results that we want them to produce. But until then, until tribal sovereignty is honored, I would at least like tribes to have an ability for judicial review for health policy decisions where they weren't consulted. My thanks, and looking forward to Dr. Owen's comments.
Thank you. Thank you to Northeastern School of Law for inviting me to speak and provide some comments here. And I'd like to thank also Professor Haas for the honor of reviewing your talk, and in general for your important work on the connections between Indian federal law and the health of Native people. I think this topic is so pertinent as we're seeing massive amounts of money now being sent out to deal with the effects of COVID, and including at least 20 to 30 billion. I keep seeing different amounts, but I believe it's up to 30 billion to tribal nations. And without effective tribal consultation, we know, as we saw with COVID, that the monies won't be dispersed the way we need them to be. And as noted in your paper as well, we'll see some of the same mistakes and tribes fighting into now for those funds that were released back then. That was supposedly released back then. I've never done this before, so excuse my any errors that I might make in how we conduct these critiques, but I'm honored to be invited to do this. It's kind of fun. In her paper, Professor Haas eliminates and addresses the discordance in the U.S. government's relationship with tribal nations. She highlights the U.S. government's recognition of the sovereignty of tribal nations, but also the federal government's seeming inability to consistently adhere to the rights of tribes. She proposes a solution in the strengthening of tribal consultation through congressional action. In the United States, hundreds of state and federally recognized tribal nations maintain sovereign rights to govern and protect their people and their lands. The basis for sovereign status originates from the U.S. government gaining Indian lands through treaties, the standard negotiation process between governments. The U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8, recognized Indian tribes as distinct from foreign nation states and the federal government. Sovereign nations have since been upheld, sovereign status has since been upheld and maintained through Supreme Court rulings, executive order, and legislative acts. Still, the US government has a long history of ignoring the sovereignty of tribal nations. Importantly, based on hundreds of treaties with tribes and subsequent Supreme Court rulings, the US government also has a trust responsibility, as Dr. Haas mentioned, or Professor Haas mentioned, to provide for the health, education, and social needs of American Indians and Alaska Natives. Ignoring tribal sovereignty infringes on these responsibilities and further threatens the health and welfare of American Indians and Alaska Natives, which Professor Haas has highlighted in previous articles nicely. Tribal consultation is a means for U.S. government to meet its trust responsibilities by recognizing rights of tribal nations to govern and protect their lands and protect their people and their lands. Tribal consultation in the U.S., however, is upheld by executive order and memorandum only. As it stands, there are no clear mandates over which decisions tribal leaders are consulted, when in the process tribal nations are consulted, and commitment to adhere to tribal recommendations and no enforcement should tribes not be consulted. Professor Haas argues that a legislatively mandated tribal consultation, if written to include judicial review, enforcement, timing, and additional key factors, could provide the United States as means to truly honor its responsibilities and relationships with tribal nations. In her paper, Professor Haas points to the wording in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as an example of what consultation could entail. Thank you for that, by the way. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples defines consultations as a means to obtain free, prior, and informed consent before adopting and implementing legislative or administrative measures that may affect the Indigenous peoples. Yet, the US government has specifically stated that our consultation does not mandate consent. If sovereignty, by definition, includes freedom from external control or autonomy, then how can it not imply the right to free, prior, and informed consent? Carla Fredericks, in her paper, Operationalizing Free, Prior, and Informed Consent, argues that a tribal free, prior, and informed consent law, a tribal one, could offer stronger protections against US government infringement on tribal sovereign rights than the current or even an expanded form of tribal consultation. I think it's important to recognize and address her idea. As she points out, this is an opportunity for Indigenous peoples in the United States to lead in a global movement to protect Indigenous sovereignty. From my position as a practicing physician, I see regularly the consequences of the lack of autonomy and control in the individual lives of Native people. I also know that ignoring our sovereignty as Native people is just one way that we are reminded of our second-class citizenship, and that the US government does not think that our issues are important. I think it's also important to talk about, as Professor Anderson did in her talk, the impacts of health outcomes from the stressors of not having our sovereign rights recognized. Professor Haas argues in a previous paper that federal Indian law is a structural determinant of health, and more specifically that tribal sovereignty is a primary mechanism to promote health and welfare of tribes and American Indians and Alaska Native people. If consultation is a means to protect sovereignty, which I think it is, then consultation is also a structural determinant of health, and Professor Haas should consider including this in her paper as well. Robert Miller describes tribal consultation as too much and too little. He recounts the experiences of tribal leadership being consulted on too many inconsequential issues, consulted after a decision has already been made, or feeling as if members, feeling as if leaders, feeling as if they're talking and no one is listening. Additional requirements to legislation mandating consultation should include, but not be limited to, language to determine which potential policies or acts require consultation from tribal leadership versus those that can be addressed by any tribal administrator, and the determination of when to consult tribes. Right now, it's up to the federal government and agencies to decide when to consult tribes. It should be up to the tribes as well. There should also be language requiring regular communication and multiple consultations over important issues, and requirements for full transparency regarding any proposed project. The current federal Indian law does not adequately address the U.S. trust responsibility to American Indian and Alaska Native tribal nations, in part because there's no, as you said, there's no guarantee of federal adherence to the sovereign rights of tribal nations, which impacts the health and welfare of Native people. Professor Haas has convincingly argued that congressional action to mandate tribal consultation could provide or help the U.S. government honor its trust responsibility to tribal nations. To strengthen your argument, you should consider addressing the proposition that a tribal free, prior, and informed consent law is more impactful for tribes than a U.S. congressional act. I suggest that you include your prior work linking federal Indian law and sovereignty to the health of American Indians and Alaska natives, and discuss how tribal consultation recognizes sovereignty and therefore impacts health outcomes. And then finally, I suggest that you consider detailing a list of important conditions and processes to include in a legislative mandate on tribal consultation. Thanks, Professor Haas, and to conference organizers for inviting me to participate in this incredibly important issue.
Thanks to you, Dr. Owen. Thank you so much.
Buenas noches.
Well, thank you, Professor Haas and Dr. Owen. I am now going to introduce our next authors and commentator pairing. So we have two authors. Our first is Paula Sepulveda Miranda, who works in clinical data and quality management at the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health. She is also the director of the Didasco Project and a research associate in psychology at Harvard Medical School. Joining her is Sonia Fernandez Quinones, who's a systems change advocate at the Sexual Violence Center and a social media manager at Didasco Project. Their commentator will be Eduardo Lugo Hernandez, who is an assistant professor at the University of Puerto Rico and the executive director of Impacto Juventud, Inc.
Hi, everyone. We're so happy to be here with you all. My name is Paola, and today we're going to be talking about the effect of second-class colonial governance over the healthcare system of Puerto Rico in comparison to Hawaii and Massachusetts.
Today, we will examine how the lack of self-determination and adequate governance hinders Puerto Rico's capacity to provide the best possible public health outcomes for its population. To prove this, we have selected the overseas states of Hawaii and the Commonwealth state of Massachusetts, both counterparts to Puerto Rico's legal status, to examine how their full incorporation into the Union provides an advantage over Puerto Rico that denotes a clear discriminatory treatment pattern against the territory. So let's talk a little bit about the history of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico has never, in all of its history, not being either a colony or an imperial territory. From 1492, it was a colony of Spain until the Spanish lost the Spanish-American War, and ceded all of the overseas colonies to the United States in 1898. Here on, Puerto Rico has belonged to the United States. I must add that there is a clear distinction between being a colony and being an imperial territory. colonialism is controlled by settling, and it's mainly what Spain did versus imperialism, which is remote economic and political control. This is mostly what the US had done until very recently. Because Puerto Rico has become a tax haven thanks to economic incentivizing laws, it has experienced a recent influx of wealthy American entrepreneurs. Although these two terms are part of a great debate, both terms in this context apply to the current case of Puerto Rico. So this discriminatory pattern against Puerto Rico started with the insular cases, which I'm going to discuss now. These cases are a compendium of Supreme Court decisions about the acquisition of non-contiguous territories ceded to the US by Spain after the Spanish-American War. During this process, the United States treated these new Spanish territories in a discriminatory way for two main reasons. The first one is geography. These territories were faraway territories overseas, and they were not contiguous to the United States mainland. The second reason has to do with its population. There were almost no Americans living in these territories, and their natives were mostly people of color with languages and cultures that are extremely different from that of the mainland US. These cases developed a doctrine that changed the procedures that the US had used to incorporate all of its contiguous territories, including Alaska, and ironically, they apply the same to Hawaii. But for these new territories, it created the legal figure of unincorporated territories. And in the case of Puerto Rico, it started this political experiment with its status, in which Puerto Rico belongs to, but it's not a part of the United States. And this is a very infamous quote from one of the cases. It also limited the reach of the Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights, regarding unincorporated territories. Puerto Rico straight up did not have equal rights until it created its own constitution in 1952. And even then, a lot of federal rights still did not apply to Puerto Ricans. Being an unincorporated territory has given way to a lot of anti-democratic processes and structures that infringe upon Puerto Rico's ability to administer itself. The latest of which is Promesa. So during the latest part of the 20th century, Puerto Rico accumulated a massive $74 billion debt. However, Puerto Rico has no right to bankruptcy under Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code because of being an unincorporated territory. For this reason, Congress created the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, Promesa, in 2016, which is a special and unique mechanism for the government and stakeholders to restructure the territory's debts. One important thing about Promesa is that it created a fiscal oversight board. Its voting members, who are the people who hold the power to decide Puerto Rico's destiny, are appointed by the president and Congress, and they are not elected by the people nor appointed by the government of Puerto Rico. Since Promesa was enacted, the board has imposed austerity measures that have failed to comply with its mandate of work with the people of Puerto Rico and the government of Puerto Rico to create the necessary foundation for economic growth and restore opportunity to the people of Puerto Rico, thus risking all public instrumentalities and dependencies on the island. So when we talk about Puerto Rico, we have to discuss the actual administrative damage done by the fact that the island is an unincorporated territory. For that, we will discuss two important political powers that other states and nations have that help improve public health outcomes. These are governance and self-determination. Governance is an emerging social-political theory regarding alternative ways of performing the act of governing that have searched within an established government structure. And this includes additional social, political, and economic actors. The intervention of these alternative actors in the administration of social and economic services varies in forms and may or may not benefit the people who they're supposed to serve, as we can see in the case of the fiscal board. What is really important is that governance agents complement the formal government structure and have a significant direct impact on the outcomes of the well-being of the population in terms of the delivery of public health services. On the other hand, self-determination is a concept that has generated great debate in the field of public international law about human rights against the state versus what foreign national powers can and can't do to intervene with another nation to protect human rights. This concept has been weaponized by both sides of the argument to favor or also shun intervention. At this moment, self-determination is regarded as both a human right that applies to peoples and not states against the abuses of the state, and as a protection in public international law that states can raise against foreign intervention. In the case of Puerto Rico can exercise neither self-determination to create and sustain an efficient government, nor generate efficient governance structure, alternatives, and protocols because of its unincorporated territory status. Now I will leave you with Paola to discuss the effect of this political work frame upon the public health outcomes of the Puerto Rican population.
Thank you. So getting into our examination of the healthcare system for our analysis, the first thing we came up with is that the health sector in the United States has always been characterized by systematic fragmentation. So the question for us then is, how is it possible to compare systems that by nature are so fragmented and differing one from another? We resolved this by establishing a methodology by focusing our examination in specific domains. These allow us to cluster aspects of the healthcare delivery system to provide a foundation for analysis and comparisons. We focus our study mainly in finances and care processes and infrastructure. By reviewing some of our findings, as it can be seen here, Puerto Rico health expenditure per capita is alarmingly lower in comparison to Hawaii, Massachusetts, and the average in mainland United States. This is of much importance since studies have demonstrated that there is a positive correlation between total per capita healthcare expenditure and labor productivity. Thus, by increasing healthcare expenditure, the health status of Americans will improve, increasing labor productivity. And as some studies has mentioned, a state's healthcare expenditure has a positive relationship with the gross domestic product of the state. Yet, since 2010, Puerto Rico has shown a decline in healthcare expenditures per capita as compared to the national average expenditure and that of Hawaii and Massachusetts. Despite the fact that the life expectancy in Puerto Rico is similar to those in mainland United States, the percentage of adults reporting fair to poor health is higher in Puerto Rico than it is in the United States, 35% in Puerto Rico compared to 18% in the United States. Moreover, Puerto Rico's residents have higher prevalence of heart attack, heart disease, diabetes, depression, disability, low birth weight infants, higher infant mortality rate, and higher numbers of people living with HIV than the United States overall. As far as epidemics go, Puerto Rico has seen outbreaks of viral diseases for the last several years, including the epidemic of Zika, with the majority of cases from the United States, 84%, being reported in Puerto Rico alone. As noted by federal health agencies, unfortunately, the 3.5 million Americans living in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico do not have access to a healthcare system considered standard in the rest of the nation. In regard to quality of available infrastructure for care processes, when examining quality data on hospitals, for an instance, Puerto Rico is much lower than any other state. Compared to the rest of the United States, Puerto Rico's hospital, when grouped together, rank last in most quality measures. From readmission to the hospital within 30 days of discharge to mortality rates in 30 days after entering a hospital, Puerto Rico rates worse than national averages. Even more revealing is the emergency department statistics, which highlights a tremendous disparity between national average waiting time in an ED, which is 4 hours and 18 minutes approximately, to, listen well, 14 hours and 30 minutes in Puerto Rico. More than twice the national average. To note, even when Hawaii and Massachusetts are among the top 10 states with longer wait times, both of them with an average of 2 hours and 10-minute wait times, Puerto Rico wait time is significantly major, again, with an average of 14 hours and 30-minute wait time. As equality measures were not enough, when it comes to quantity, Puerto Rico also lacks enough hospitals, hospital beds, and specialized hospitals to serve adequately its residents. Not to mention that the geographic distribution of these hospitals is less than optimal to most of the population, since these institutions are not sparse equitably in the archipelago. Because to note, we are an archipelago with municipalities that are not attached to the main island. For ICU beds, for an instance, there are only 70 intensive care unit hospital beds per 1 million persons compared to 290 beds per 1 million on mainland United States. Furthermore, using the novel COVID-19 epidemic, when comparing Puerto Rico's response to the pandemic against both Massachusetts and Hawaii, Puerto Rico's lack of resources to properly handle the emergency as a direct result of its governing colonial status has left the archipelago yet again in the dark. Specifically, some major concerns the archipelago faces are the number of resources available to treat sick residents and to detect the virus, and now to administer the vaccine doses among its residents. When we discuss vaccine rollout, we can speculate from a myriad of reasons why the vaccination in Puerto Rico is so far behind in comparison to Hawaii and Massachusetts. As you can see in this image, Puerto Rico has been able to only administer 56% of the vaccines that has received, while Hawaii has done 75% and Massachusetts 87%. Similarly, Puerto Rico is significantly below in residents who have received one shot or are fully vaccinated in comparison to Hawaii and Massachusetts. Another issue we found in regards to infrastructure was Puerto Rico data reporting, specifically when examining federal health data. When it comes to daily reports around hospitals' critical staffing shortage, of those reports, Puerto Rico did not report any information on an average of 35% compared to much lower missing reports by Hawaii and Massachusetts. The most alarming data piece was that for the last month, so March 1st, 2021 to now April 10th, 2021, data was collected daily to report ICU beds utilization attributed to COVID use. Puerto Rico did not report at all. So again, this leads to believe that the main reason for non-compliance ends up being Puerto Rico's lack of adequate infrastructure to carry out these activities. As we have discussed previously, this is a direct effect of all the factors that give way to our research. Lack of self-determination and the economic crisis derive also from those issues. In terms of critical staffing shortage specifically, we can even peek into the effect of the economical debacle that has led thousands of young professionals to emigrate to other states in search for a better life. And there are multiple studies that examine this, kind of trying to track how many people is leaving the island. And per year, they believe that since 2016 at least, there is a 25% of health professionals that are leaving the island per year at least, which is an alarming number. So kind of in a way of summarizing our paper, some major takeaways are that when analyzing Puerto Rico healthcare system without the context of its political and historical context with the legal limitations that implies, promotes failure. Developing possible remedies and interventions to alleviate shortfalls, to promote better response to public health emergencies, and finally improve the healthcare system throughout in order to achieve, better population health outcomes, without examining the limitations that its governing colonial status imposes in the archipelago, is a disservice to Puerto Rico and to the American citizens residing in Puerto Rico. As long as Puerto Rico remains a colony and imperial territory of the United States, we believe it's very important for Congress to take steps to end the discriminatory treatment of the archipelago when it comes to access to resources. Because ironically enough, when it comes to accessing participation in responsibilities, Puerto Rico has the same responsibilities as any other incorporated states. Yet when it comes to benefit from giving, there is a clear discriminatory process against the archipelago. And finally, we want to say that recommendations about improving Puerto Rico's government and governance structure without addressing its colonial status as a structural problem is an injustice that will continue to perpetuate current failures in the system that ultimately lead to an unhealthy population experiencing a second-class treatment in health, and beyond. With nothing else, we would like to thank you all for this space and listening to our research, and we're looking forward to hear your comments and questions. And we want to thank Dr. Lugo for joining us to offer his commentaries for our paper.
Hello to everybody. I want to thank Sonja and Paola for inviting me to comment on their paper, on the wonderful paper. It was a well-written article, and thanks to both of them for analyzing and denouncing this grave human rights issue. Beginning the article with a historical recounting of US policy in relation to Puerto Rico, and the challenge of the language used to validate an unjust relationship is paramount in moving forward in the struggle to develop a more just environment for people living in Puerto Rico. It is important to start telling these stories to the public both in the US and Puerto Rico so that the struggle for social justice can be nurtured with civic engagement and political activism. This is something that as researchers, we tend to neglect by solely focusing on academic discussions, which are valuable, but insufficient to promote change. Disparity in health resources has severe consequences as established by Paola and Sonja. This is not limited to physical health, but also impacts mental health, which I suggest that they integrate more into the discussion. As Paola and Sonja stated, this situation has become even worse in recent years by the imposition of the US government of an anti-democratic fiscal board whose powers exceed those of our own government. This sheds the veil on a democratic society with self-governance and puts the spotlight on top of an oppressive relationship where a people have little or no power to self-govern and have representation but no voice in the US Congress. The fiscal model of this board has been austerity, for which there is evidence worldwide of its ineffectiveness and deleterious effect on people's health. Some of the documented consequences have been an increase in mental health problems, suicide, and the decay of health systems to respond to people's needs. In places like Greece, it had grave public health consequences as needle exchange programs had to be cut and HIV infections soared after that. Here we have to reiterate that austerity is a fiscal model imposed by an anti-democratic board, as we call it in Puerto Rico, la Junta, as we say, that neglects our ability to establish our own priorities, leading way to pay an unpayable and not audited debt. Its dealings with vulture funds and bondholders prioritize payments while mortgaging our future, our children and youth futures. It also places, it also places the lives of the elderly in precarious positions with potential cuts to pensions and the increased decay of our health system. Mental health has been severely impacted in times when we face the brunt of the climate crisis. Hurricane Maria and Irma, earthquakes, and the COVID-19 pandemic are some of the repeated experiences of trauma that have increased mental health needs. In the meantime, services are not adequate. Waiting times for appointments, doctor time spent with clients, and quality of services are some of the concerns that are repeatedly expressed. The impact of unattended mental health problems will be felt in a diminished quality of life for Puerto Rico residents, migration seeking a quote unquote better life, physical health problems, and other negative consequences. The impact of austerity transcends health services in Puerto Rico as it spills into every aspect of our lives, including education, where schools have been closed and our public universities under siege and on the brink of extinction, as the fiscal board has steadily cut funding and is now requesting additional cuts that amount to $94 million. This is an emergency situation for Puerto Ricans' health status, as education is closely related to poverty and the potential for social mobility, which in turn is related to health outcomes. Poverty is one of the greatest risk factors for negative health outcomes. Also, funding cuts put at risk our public medical school, which is one of the greatest sources of physicians in the island. It is paramount to highlight that although Puerto Rico as a whole is affected by the colonial relation to the US, there are communities that are more affected. Yes, disparities exist based on gender and race. However, I want to highlight the experience of the people living in Vieques and Culebras. These are two small islands that are municipalities of Puerto Rico. Residents of these two municipalities have suffered through having their island as a bombing range for the US Navy, having the US Navy breach their commitment to cleaning bombing areas, and having a deficient maritime transportation system. This is compounded by the fact that residents do not have a hospital of adequate healthcare services. This situation is a humanitarian crisis that should be an embarrassment for the US and Puerto Rico governments. Changing Puerto Rico's status is paramount to promote justice for people in the archipelago. However, this is not only a policy action, but also a psychological one. Coloniality has impacted Puerto Ricans' minds. Colonial rule and conquest is not only political, but psychological in nature. In this sense, the disparities outlined by Paola and Sonja are not seen or realized by most people in the archipelago, who see the influx of federal funding as proof of our inability to survive without this relationship. Many see attempts to shed light into the disparities we face as an ungrateful action, and some may fear consequences. Colonialism is psychological warfare that needs to be overcome to promote change. The disparities we face are human rights issues, one that has been invisibilized by the language the US uses to define a relationship. However, this is not a language issue, but a survival one. Implications of our colonial status are life or death. Thanks to Paola and Sonja for this amazing job. I hope it is read and heard by many and that it serves as an important policy function. Thank you to both of them.
Thank you, Eduardo.
Thank you, Eduardo, for bringing up Vieques and Culebra and being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys.
Yes, and thank you all for an incredibly informative and important discussion. I would like to now introduce our next author and commentator pairing. We have two authors, Professor Wendy Parmet, the Matthews Distinguished University Professor of Law and the Faculty Director of the Center for Health Policy and Law at Northeastern University School of Law. And Professor Parmet is also a Professor of Public Policy and Urban Affairs at Northeastern University. Joining her will be Professor Jeremy Paul, who is a Professor of Law at Northeastern University School of Law. And their commentator will be Professor Leslie Francis, who is a Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and Law at the University of Utah.
So I have my slides all set to load and they're not loaded, which I don't know why. They're on my screen, but it claims it cannot be loaded. So no.
Jennifer, if you want, I thought I was gonna share. Do you want to manage them?
I don't think you're a co-host.
No, I don't.
So
Sorry, folks.
Yes, Wendy, you're a co-host. You can go ahead and share.
try that.
It's not letting me. Okay, oh, now I can. Okay, I will do that.
It worked a minute ago.
Do people see my slides? Our slides? Okay.
Oh, Wendy, you bailed this out. Thank you very much. Okay, let's see what we can do here now. I seem to have lost this. Hold on. All right, it's all set up. Look at that. What can we do? All right, I'm just going to start without my script because we have to talk. So anyway, I want to thank everybody for attending the conference and particularly the organizers and Jennifer Huber, who took the lead, and also especially Professor Francis, who sent us wonderful comments in advance and gives a lot to think about. So this paper is part of a project that Wendy and I have been working on for a long time. We started this before the pandemic, and those who've worked with Wendy in the past know that she has a knack for seeing things in advance of other people. We actually had a conference here a few years ago on the coming pandemics where Anthony Fauci was the keynote speaker, and sometime in early 2019, she suggested to me that this post-truth problem was something that would be particularly important for public health. And so we started to work on it then, and we did a couple of op-ed pieces for The Current but little did we know that the pandemic was going to hit and that post-truth would become such an immediate and deadly problem. This is the first chance we've had to present this paper together. And so we're really looking forward to hearing your comments. So when the pandemic did hit, it wasn't long until the World Health Organization labeled this an infodemic, which they described as the proliferation of false and misleading information about pretty much everything related to the pandemic. It has undoubtedly undermined all sorts of public efforts with respect to COVID-19, including getting people to wear masks, and in particular, trust in vaccines. We all know about the former president's obsession with hydroxychloroquine, his intermittent castigation of masks, but even the change in the White House has not slowed the spread of misinformation. Just this week, NPR reported that the 4 of the 5 leading stories downloaded on Facebook about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine were from ABC, CNN, the New York Times, and Fox. But the single most downloaded source was from a blogger named Anomaly, who used this as a way of trying to explain to people that COVID-19 vaccines were all a way for the government to seize control over the people. Wendy received a press inquiry from France about asking her to confirm a story there that Senator Robert F. Kennedy Jr. had just won a lawsuit against Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci in the United States Supreme Court, in which the court had ruled that universal vaccinations were no longer permitted, and that the article said that the type of vaccine that we got from Pfizer and Moderna was manipulating our genes and changing us from earthlings into genetically modified organisms. So this is seriously a problem that we, in fact, need to deal with. Of course, misinformation about plagues and vaccines is not a new thing, but our view is that the current infodemic is different, and it's gone beyond traditional vaccine rejection and science skepticism. And we sometimes think of this as moving from snake oil salesmen who try to persuade you of miracle cures to wholesale debunkers who try to strip you altogether of your ability to differentiate between a cure and a disease. So we decided to investigate this topic, and we want to link it, as the slide suggests, to this broader notion of post-truth that has been becoming increasingly prominent in the literature. We encountered writers such as Lee McIntyre, Tom Nichols, Naomi Oreskes, Yochai Benkler, Masha Gessen, and others who really validated our sense that we were in a different period, that something serious had gone wrong with the public's ability to receive, sort, and act upon accurate information. And we really had 2 stages. I'm going to do the first, and then Wendy will do the second. The first one was just to try to gain a handle on what is really meant by post-truth. What are the things that make our period different? And we identified 3 attributes. The first one we refer to as the loss of confidence, that when people sit down to try to solve a problem, that there's actually hope of reaching agreement altogether. Instead, it feels to us as though in public debate, radio shows, television shows, even sadly in our classes more and more, that people seem to view debate as something in which I toss out my side, you toss out your side, and there's really not hope that we're going to be able to look to experts to give us a solution. And in our paper, we describe what happens when that happens to you is if you no longer believe that you can reason your way to solve problems, but nonetheless, you still have to make choices. And one of the things that we stress a great deal about living in a consumer society is that more and more and more, you're forced to make a lot of choices about what products to buy, how to spend your money, what to do about retirement, etc. More and more you start to make these decisions not on the basis of expertise or rationality, but instead on the basis of which side am I on? What do my people do? And we've seen that just tragically with respect to masks in the pandemic, that people think somehow or other it's a badge of honor not to wear a mask. And then finally, as this, what we describe as a descent into post-truth continues, people seem to be becoming more and more comfortable with the idea that there really is no such thing as a fact, that it's all just a question of which side are you on. And we then identified certain things like confirmation bias and the Dunning-Kruger effect, which amplify this sense of no such thing as a fact. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the less you know, the more comfortable you are with your position because you don't feel as though you need to change. And so we really think that this problem is a big one. And the question is then how to fight it. We were particularly impressed by a study recently from RAND about Russian propaganda, which they describe as the fire hose of falsehood. And our classic First Amendment theory and the way we often think about things in the United States is, well, what we're going to do with falsehood is we're just going to respond by getting the truth out there. And if we get the truth out there, that will solve the problem. But this study with respect to Russian propaganda demonstrates very convincingly that we're fighting the fire hose of falsehood, multiple channels, social media, repetitive positions, with the squirt gun of truth. And so we wanted to look more deeply into, are there things other than just media campaigns that have been the source of this problem and might help us to move towards solutions. And one of those things, there are, of course, many causes of the post-truth position: political polarization, rise of social media, a lying president, loss of faith in institutions, income inequality. But we don't question any of those. But we thought it's got to be the case that something that's so profound and so difficult for the country to deal with has to have resonance in lots of other areas. And of course, we chose law as the place to look because that's our lane. And we thought that we could find some sources there. And we did. And so in the second half of the paper, we turned to health law in particular to see, were there changes in health law that might have contributed to this. And ironically, we found that some of the things that we most value and applaud about the changes in health law, such as the kind of emphasis on never again having situations where people are experimented on, as they were during the Nazi period, without informed consent, this is certainly something that we would embrace. But like many of the best changes that happen, it turned out to have unintended consequences and perhaps help to lead us down the path towards the post-truth world in which we find ourselves. And that's the story that we tell, and I'm now going to leave it to Wendy to tell that story.
Thank you, Jeremy. And I'm going to try to be quick because we have lots to discuss, and hoping there's still time for Q&A before our other panel. And I do want to emphasize what Jeremy just said. We are looking for what are the changes in health law that have taken place over the last half century plus, really, that not so much caused post-truth, but in a sense created a receptivity to post-truth. And many of these changes are undoubtedly valuable and important and were put in place for really important reasons. Jeremy just mentioned the Nazis' doctor's trial, from which sort of some of our earliest principles of informed consent came. The Tuskegee syphilis study is another example where the rights of individuals were really just completely ignored. It was a racist study, and where the rights of patients, their dignity and their health and their rights and autonomy were undermined in reaction to such incidents. And there have been way too many in the history of medicine and public health. we began to put in place in this country a series of rules and regulations and legal reforms, most famously back to the common rule, in which informed consent of subjects in human trials becomes the key tenet. Importantly, informed consent as a principle does not only apply to human subject research. In the 1970s, as many of you probably know, courts began to hold that physicians have a duty to provide patients with information that reasonable patients would find material prior to making their decision. In doing so, the courts emphasized patient self-determination, and they also expressed, importantly, the view that in order to reach their own decisions and sort of exercise their self-determination, patients needed to receive information from physicians. In the 1970s, therefore, informed consent did not imply that patients knew as much as or didn't need, in a sense, the support and information from their providers. It simply allowed them then to get that information and make their own determinations based on their own preferences, values, and life circumstances. In later cases, such as starting with In re Quinlan, courts moved beyond requiring physicians to provide information to patients to recognizing that patients or their surrogates had the right to choose to reject life-sustaining treatment. In Cruzan, importantly, the Supreme Court of the United States said that the logical corollary of the doctrine of informed consent is that the patient reasonably possesses the right not to consent, that is, to refuse treatment. Concurring in Cruzan, Justice O'Connor went further, stating that an individual has a constitutionally protected liberty interest in refusing unwanted medical care. We can also see the evolution of the recognition of patient decisions, the patient's right to decide, again, for many important and good reasons. In abortion law, in early abortion law in particular. In Roe, the court emphasized that the decision to have an abortion was one that a woman could make in conjunction with her physician. Thus, again, in the 1973, the same era where courts were first developing sort of modern informed consent, the court affirmed medical authority as much as the right of patient decision-making. But by the time of Casey, almost 20 years later, the court had come to recognize this right as the right of the woman. And in later cases, courts have accepted abortion restrictions on patients' access to abortion that rest on scientific rationales that are not supported by any scientific consensus. In effect, abortion jurisprudence has perhaps descended to a battle between the claims of autonomy of lay individuals on the one hand and the claims of pseudoscience on the other. To be sure, the Supreme Court in Whole Women's Health struck Texas regulation of abortion clinics based largely on the fact that the claims were not supported by the science. But whether this reliance on expertise will persist after Chief Justice Roberts' concurring decision last June in June Health and Justice Barrett's ascension to the court seems questionable. In either case, by relying on scientific claims that are wholly unsupported by the evidence, abortion opponents have helped, however unwittingly, to topple medical authority. For our purposes, however, we don't really want to focus just on abortion. The broader women's health movement of the late 90s sought to challenge medical patriarchy, emphasizing that women should be educated about their own health and free to make their own decisions about their body. This movement helped to push for direct-to-consumer drug labels. Indeed, this labeling first came for contraception and estrogen replacement therapies, and to challenge the learned intermediary doctrine, among other changes. All of these changes, which are positive in our view, also help to dismantle the gatekeeping and information providing function of healthcare providers. Now, pharmaceutical companies were going to speak directly to the patient, unmediated by the provider. Indeed, the very idea of our bodies ourselves, the foundational book of the women's health movement, was that women, and eventually all individuals, need not and should not rely on experts to learn about their own health. We also discuss in the paper the important role of AIDS activism. Responding to the government's neglect of the HIV epidemic, I should say shameful neglect, activists mounted an effective campaign to push for a greater role for patients and activists in setting the agenda for biomedical research and deciding when investigational drugs should be made available. Their movement led to important changes to NIH and FDA policies, some of which were codified. These helped to fast track drug development and led to expanded use of compassionate use policies. As we show in our paper, many other patient advocacy groups followed suit, pushing for greater deregulation by the FDA. These efforts also helped to loosen regulation of dietary and nutritional supplement and help the whole wellness industry get going. And again, they supported the view that patients, in addition to, or sometimes in contradiction to physicians and the FDA, should be the decision makers. Without question, all of these movements have done much good in questioning medical paternalism, enhancing respect for individuals, and for groups who had often been left voiceless and ignored or mistreated by medical authority. But these developments have also aligned with the interests of industries such as the pharmaceutical and dietary supplement industry and advocates for an increasingly libertarian pro-market interpretation of the First Amendment. This has led to constraining FDA's role while also allowing patients to largely and frequently sidestep physicians. More recently, the Supreme Court's diminution of the Zadora, a rational basis for review for compelled speech, has thrown into doubt regulators' ability to even compel truthful health-related speech in advertising and potentially accompanying the provision of vaccines or other treatments. In short, in today's world, patients learn about diseases, prevention, and treatments largely through advertising and social media, and they take that information to their physicians, or in some cases, they just go directly to the website that the ad tells them to go to get the prescription and the medication. Shortened medical visits, pushed by billing pressures, have magnified this development. Today's patients are faced with more choices than ever before and less access to and have less faith in experts. In effect, patients have come to be expected to be experts, to make a plethora of decisions related to their own health and the health of their own and families, often unencumbered by expertise. All of this was before the pandemic. So what does this have to do with post-truth? By prioritizing individual choices and castigating paternalism, health law has helped to erode trust in expertise, but it has not stopped at fostering healthy, if sometimes contentious, dialogue between patients and experts, as I think we saw during the period of AIDS activism. Rather, it has helped to undermine regulatory agencies, such as the FDA and CDC and state public health agencies that once served to educate the public about health-related matters. And it is also weakened in the name of patient choice and giving patients skin in the game to provide a patient relationship. As we write in the paper, the culture of patient choice and personal responsibility has taught individuals that they are as competent as experts to decide whether masks reduce the transmission of COVID-19, whether COVID-19 is no more dangerous than the seasonal flu, or whether vaccines work. The mantra of patient empowerment that the law has embraced and facilitated gives little weight to verification, falsification, replication, or the benefit of years of study. Gut feelings, often enhanced by affiliation, partisanship, or the pleasant music in the commercial, seem to be given greater credence than peer-reviewed papers, expert panels, or careful conversations and dialogues with physicians who know the patient well. In writing this, we do not mean to suggest that health law and bioethics are solely or primarily responsible for post-truth. Indeed, we believe that the transformation of health law that we have described is as much symptom as cause. Yet this is an important moment for those of us who are in health law and legal scholars to consider how our field may have, for the best of reasons, unintentionally nurtured the seeds of post-truth. As COVID-19 and the climate crisis remind us, nature is not bemused by our subjectivity. It does not respect our atomistic autonomy. If we are to prevent future crises, and indeed if we are to be true to informed consent's original goal of respecting human dignity and giving individuals meaningful choices, we must find a way to privilege skepticism and autonomy without inviting nihilism.
So I'm the commentator, and I want to add my voice to the chorus of thanks to everyone for this fantastic symposium. So I'm just delighted to be here. My comments in a nutshell are a warning not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And that's my general worry about Parmet and Paul's presentation. The issue of post-truth is, of course, a critical one for contemporary health policy. My disagreement lies with the direction Parmet and Paul take in diagnosing the problem. They lay partial blame, and they're careful about this, it's partial, at the door of two movements in contemporary health law: support for individual autonomy and direct-to-consumer advertising. Their concerns are worthwhile, but where they go with them worries me a lot. I think their trouble starts with how they understand post-truth. They don't fully define the idea. Instead, they give some of its attributes, and a big example, mistrust in science, such as in the vaccines and autism debate. And they link this to a generalized suspicion of expertise. They characterize post-truth as self-reliance about the truth, which in turn becomes reliance on affiliations that are self-reinforcing. Post-truth, they think, is radical individualism about knowledge, which falters in the face of human cognitive limitations. Criticism of this radical individualism isn't surprising for public health law scholars, but post-truth isn't just epistemological individualism complicated by cognitive limits. It's epistemological individualism hijacked by ideology. People want to believe what they want to be true for worldview reasons that are in turn both political and structural. And this is the dimension of ideology that I think they leave out, both in how they describe post-truth and in how they attribute what happened to patient autonomy and the original cases about commercial speech. So the rise of patient decision-making, understood as autonomy and the reasonable patient standard for informed consent, was a rejection of paternalism. As Parmet and Paul see it, this became the idea that patients were their own judges of the science. And even a patient's right to reject treatment or choose it over the medical authority, over the authority of medicine, or even the authority of the state. But the idea that patients, in consultation with their doctors, should be able to perform their own risk-benefit balancing is about the critical role of patient values. How much risk are people willing to take, and to what ends? That's not the same as patients being authoritative about the facts. In fact, it depends on good facts. Parmet and Paul are right that all of this became politicized, as they describe about abortion and HIV advocacy, but they need to push on why this politicization, not just that the politicization. And I think opposition to gay rights, opposition to women's rights, and the interests served by this opposition not simply respect for patients' values, was what led to the perversion. Now think about the early commercial speech cases. Here too, Parmet and Paul focus on promoting individual choice and access to information. But recall that the initial commercial speech cases about the availability of abortion advertising or letting consumers know the prices of drugs promoted choice by ensuring that individuals had access to critical information. Among the many developments in what Justice Kagan called the weaponizing of speech was the identification of commercial speakers with individual actors. It wasn't the availability of information to individuals. The primary problem here isn't the speech or even protection of commercial speech that matters to individuals. Rather, it's the identification of commercial actors as individual speakers and the more general role of market incentives in medicine. Once again, I think political ideology came in playing an important role in misshaping what respect for individuals might mean. Now, I deliberately did this as quickly as I could because I know we're out of time. But in conclusion, I'd urge Wendy and Jeremy to consider more fully how respect for individuals made manifest in movements for consumer choice got hijacked by ideologies that are so seriously problematic for public health. Thanks very much. And I hope everything goes well for all the rest of this.
Great. Well, thank you all for your great and interesting presentation and commentary. It is now time for our Q&A session. So I would like to introduce the moderator, Professor Jonathan Kahn, who is a professor of law and biology at Northeastern University.
Hi, thanks, Andrew. So we are running over a little bit, and we do want to preserve some time for a little bit of a break for people because we know, Zoom conferences can take it out of some of us. And I also want to make sure that we do start our next panel on time at 3:45, which is the panel we are doing cooperatively with the American Journal of Public Health. I think maybe what we can do is certainly I encourage anybody to post any questions they have to the chat. I'm going to pose at least one question that I took sort of from a back and forth in the chat and see if we can at least engage with that one a little bit, and then maybe have, as I say, a little time for people to get up and shake it off before the next presentation. So the question or comment that I'd like to start out with at least is something where there's a little back and forth regarding this comment that was posted in the chat, which is, and this was directed to Paula and Sonia's presentation, but it also connects it up with Isla's presentation, is recognizing that the political contexts differ importantly. I'd be curious to hear more about how this is playing out in other territories and where important distinctions or similarities lie. And I know Paula or Sonia, responded to that briefly in the chat, but I was just wondering if either of you had anything more you wanted to say in response to that observation or question.
Sure. In my experience in the past meeting people from specifically Guam, I know from listening to stories that there are a lot of similarities in the treatment of Guam as well, because it still remains a overseas territory for the United States, and the treatment is very similar to what Puerto Rico is going through. It exists in this in between what Hawaii is because of the type of tourism that's done there and the militarism going on there, and Puerto Rico because it's not fully a state. So this is something that we would love to look up more into, because I'm sure that across whatever territories are left, I think it's 5 total, including the Virgin Islands, There are similarities in the treatment, but we would have to dig deeper into the legal doctrines that enforce it.
Exactly. In general, we can say, the insular cases are the doctrine that reigns above them all, but the insular cases itself are not consistent in how they deal with each specific territory, ironically enough. And there is a lot of Supreme cases that goes about, the differences between Guam and Puerto Rico in different determinations. So in some sense, I would say that Puerto Rico sometimes even has been granted even more rights than Guam, for an instance, based on Supreme Court interpretation of the insular cases doctrine. So that differs, and that is something that within the scope of our paper, we are working, but mostly focused in terms of how it compares to a Commonwealth, which is what Puerto Rico is referred to, an incorporated Commonwealth, versus to a territorial island that is Hawaii, which some geographical similarities to what is Puerto Rico, but that it is incorporated in that sense.
That's great. Thank you. So I just want to have one more question then, and then I think, we'll have, 5 to 7 minutes, something like that. Again, for a break, I encourage everybody to keep in mind that at 3:45, we will be starting the panel on the fascist threat to health. But I have one quick question for Courtney, thinking about the costs, the health costs of activism, and the sort of the wearing of activism, is how you think that might compare with sort of the flip side, the health, and this can be conceived in many other ways, but sort of the health costs of not being an activist. And not just in the sense of, well, then you don't get change, but also in the sense of kind of, internalizing the oppression, internalizing the racism, not having an outlet for it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And so I mentioned the studies that show the stress and related mental and physical health impacts of activism, but also there have been studies that shown that it is an outlet, as you just mentioned, to feel as though you're, creating change and moving momentum. So it does have like that positive effect. It's just that, overall the physical and mental health effects negate that. But I think we can all think of times where like maybe you've been too much into your work at the expense of sleep or something like that, but ultimately you like to do the work and you have positive impacts from doing the work. So I think, there's the health impacts of activism. And then I think if you don't engage, there's not having that type of feeling of being proactive and feeling that you're doing anything, but there just needs to be some kind of compensatory measure for people who we expect to drive change. If we're recognizing that grassroots organization should result in legislation and policy change for the underlying issue, that health should just accompany that as well.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Thanks so much. I'm really sorry to not have more time to discuss. All of the papers were so fantastic. And I really felt that there's a very nice sort of synergy between them as well. But I want to give you all, I guess, 7 minutes to, get up, stretch, and so forth. But please, we do want to try to start things back up promptly at 3:45 so we can have the full time for that panel. So we'll see you all in a few minutes.
We'll be starting again in just a few seconds. Thank you everyone for joining us and returning. Thank you also to everyone who's following us on YouTube.
Okay, so welcome back, everybody. I am delighted to be able to introduce this next panel. I just want to say to start with that we at Northeastern have just been so pleased to be able to collaborate with the American Journal of Public Health on putting this panel on the fascist threat to health together, and so much appreciated their engagement and enthusiasm for this project. The panel itself also does align with a call that the AJPH currently has regarding call for papers regarding issues addressing the fascist threat to public health. I am simply going to introduce the convener of the panel and then turn it over to him. And that is Alfredo Moravia, who is the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Public Health and a professor of epidemiology at City University of New York and Columbia University. And without further ado, Alfredo, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this introduction and for introducing the panel. I mean, it's really my great honor to be able to have a panel with these great historians and public health persons and to discuss the issue of the fascist threat to health. I mean, each of the panelists have such an incredible history that if I presented it in all detail, it would take, the whole panel time. So I'm going to be very brief for each of the participants to introduce them, but please go and look. They all have fantastic websites and where you see everything about their life, their publications, and what they're doing now. So let me start by introducing Dr. Mary Bassett. Mary Bassett, she's the director of the François-Xavier Baniou Center for Health and Human Rights. It's often called here FXB, Center for Health and Human Rights. And she is also a professor of the practice of health and human rights in the Department of Social and Behavioral Science at the Harvard T.C. Chan School of Public Health. Before that, Dr. Bassett was the health commissioner of New York City from 2014 to 2018. And she's written recently about issues of human rights, of racism, structural racism in the Lancet, and about Black Lives Matter in the New England Journal of Medicine. So welcome, Mary. Then let me introduce to you and also meet for the first time Professor Ruth Ben-Ghiat. Professor Ben-Ghiat is a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University. And her latest book is Strongmen, From Mussolini to the Present. And let me add that the present include the former US president. And this book is about two aspects of strongmen. On one side, how do leaders use corruption, violence, propaganda, and machismo to stay in power, and also how resistance to them can be developed and has actually unfolded over time. And she has an online publication called Lucid. It's about also abuses of power and how we can counter them. And I have to say that Professor Ben-Ghiat has 120,000 followers on Twitter, which is really remarkable. Welcome, Ruth. Then let me turn to Professor Richard Evans. Professor Richard Evans is an historian of the 19th and 20th century Europe with special focus on Germany. He's currently Emeritus Fellow and Honorary Fellow at Wolfson College at Cambridge University. And before that, he was Regius Professor of History at the University of Cambridge and President of Cambridge Wolfson's College. Among his many books, I think he has 18 of them, there is a 3-volume book about the Third Reich. And his last book is about another, I would say another, because Richard is certainly one fantastic historian, and whose name was Eric Hobsbawm. And he has Eric Hobsbawm, A Life in History. And since we are in pandemic time, I have to mention what I always say to my students on the history of epidemiology, that he wrote the best book that I know describing the impact of an epidemic in a population, and it's called Death in Hamburg. And this was an epidemic of cholera that hit Hamburg in 1892. Welcome, Richard. And then Paul Windling is a historian, expert of, in particular, in many domains, but in particular, about the history of science under the National Socialism. And he's currently Wellcome Trust Research Professor in the History of Medicine School of History, Philosophy, and Culture in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Science at Oxford Brookes University. Among the many books that I read from Paul Windling, I want to mention two, especially relevant for this panel. He wrote in 2014, Victims and Survivors of Nazi Human Experiments, Science and Suffering in the Holocaust. And the other one from 2017 is the editor, From Clinic to Concentration Camp, Reassessing Nazi Medical and Racial Research, 1933-1945. So incredible. These are our panelists. So, I mean, we are going to have a terrific discussion about the potential impact of fascism on health, in particular from the perspective of the United States, since this point has been extremely discussed over the last year, and it's still after the events, the insurrection of January 6th in the Capitol, is still, you know, a very serious question to be raised. And I'm extremely grateful for Northeastern, for my colleague Wendy Parmet, for Jennifer Hoare to have organized this panel together. All right, so let's start. My first question is going to be to Ruthie. If you allow me, I'm going to use your first names.
Absolutely.
That's the tradition, I mean, but I can do otherwise. So, I mean, you've studied all those strong men, leaders, from Mussolini, Hitler. Were there some aspects, some traits, some characteristics in those leaders that you know, you were thinking of when you were looking at the previous president of the United States?
So in my book, Strong Men, which kind of isolates this playbook they use of corruption and machismo and violence and the myth of national greatness and propaganda, and show how, you know, Donald Trump was, he didn't wreck democracy, he didn't have time. But it's very important that he never intended to be a democratic president with a small d. His aims in coming into office were not those of regular presidents. So his aims were to amass as much power as possible and turn public office into a machine to make money for Trump Organization and spread hatred and legitimate extremism so he could keep Americans polarized. And these are classic autocratic goals. So public welfare, even in a crisis like the pandemic, was of no interest to him. And when the pandemic started and I was giving interviews and I would say that Trump truly doesn't care if you live or die, people would get upset because it was too bleak. This was in March 2020, and they didn't really want to hear this. But it was very interesting. After that, he used all of these tools of authoritarians' rule to manage the pandemic and the corruption, where he pitted, state officials and governors. He kind of punished those who weren't loyal to him. So he did that whole kind of thing, that style of governance. He also used disinformation extensively. He also used the pandemic to increase his leader cult. And I wrote a piece in the New Yorker, I think it was last December, about how, as we know, he had coronavirus, but he had special treatment. And then he came back and he said, I feel more powerful than ever. So he managed the cycle of his illness and recovery kind of, it burnished the personality cult of the leader who is a superior male. So it goes into the machismo. And in his instinctive, response to the pandemic, he had the same priority as Bolsonaro in Brazil and Orban, and it was not to save lives, but to expand his power and not to contain the disease as much as maintain control of the narrative. Because for Trump, everything is about the optics and the framing. And so he, as you know, sought to suppress or manipulate information that might harm his popularity. So it's a very interesting case study of the way that what he did compared to other autocrats who were much farther ahead in the process of autocratic capture. So, in Hungary, as we know, Orban declared a state of emergency and used this crisis to complete his autocratic capture. So he rules by decree. And, it can work both ways, though, because obviously Trump was voted out and his criminal mismanagement of the pandemic was one contributing factor. And now Bolsonaro is in trouble. His ratings are going down as it's a true crisis there. So, the authoritarianism is always the myth of authoritarian efficiency with Hitler's Autobahns and Mussolini making the trains run on time. It covers up this history of disaster, of dysfunctional government, of chaos and corruption. And Richard, Professor Evans, has done pioneering work on corruption, Nazi corruption that I used. And I just wanted to say something about the original fascist who supposedly made the trains run on time, but actually imposed a politics of austerity that consciously reduced the calories. He had an anti-consumption policy that reduced the calories of Italians and setting up disastrous effects for disease and popular nutrition. And I'll just close with a speech he made in 1928. This is Mussolini. And he said, fortunately, the Italian people has always been poor and has not yet accustomed itself to eat many times a day. So they have a natural, modest expectation and they feel suffering less. And this kind of says everything about the attitude of the authoritarian to his people, where he despises them, wants to exploit them. And when there's a public health crisis, this all becomes very dire.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Ruth. For the organization, if the other panelists want to intervene after each of you respond to my question, that's possible. And then at the end, when every one of you has spoken, we'll open for the question to the public. So if there is no immediate intervention, let me ask a question to you, Richard. In 1933, how likely did it look, when Hitler became chancellor, and that he could, in very few weeks or months, take control of Germany and actually paralyze all its democratic system? How likely was it? Because the speed of it seems to be very relevant when we talk about the the risk of fascism in the United States?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to this symposium. I want to take a step back and say that it's wrong to use the word fascism to describe threats to democracy in the present day. There's a huge literature on it and on fascism, and today's populists like Trump and Bolsonaro are not, frankly, fascist. So the basic premise underlying this whole destruction, I think, is wrong. There's really three reasons why it's wrong to regard Trump and Bolsonaro and the rest of them as fascists. As Ruth said, their main aims are to amass power and money, but that wasn't the main aim of fascist leaders like Hitler and Mussolini, although they did that as well. They were ideologues, okay? So fascism, first of all, is fundamentally, it's militaristic. Its inner aim, its central aim was to wage war on other countries, to invade, conquer, and enlarge their territory. Mussolini wanted to create a Roman Empire, a new Roman Empire in the Mediterranean, invading several countries to do that. Hitler, we know about his aggression. Hungarian fascists wanted to recover territory lost in 1919 and so on. But Trump is an isolationist, was an isolationist. He wanted to withdraw American troops from foreign commitments. And secondly, I think militarism meant putting the whole country into uniform. It meant regimenting, drilling the population, eliminating the individual in the interest of the collective. Or in other words, what Mussolini and Hitler and the others regarded as the supreme race which they represented and led. Of course, fascists had a cult of the heroic individual, but ordinary citizens are supposed to subordinate themselves in the mass adulation of men like Hitler and Mussolini. And the fascist state wanted to establish total control over its citizens. They weren't allowed an individual initiative in politics or in public and other walks of life. Trump, seems to me, and other contemporary populists have preached the opposite, the freedom of the individual from government interference. The idea of far-right militias in the US putting on military uniforms like Nazi stormtroopers is just simply inconceivable. And thirdly, and I think most importantly, as far as we're concerned, fascism thought of itself. Certainly, well, this is one of the differences in a way, but above all, Hitler thought of his movement as anti-Christian, as pro-science and pro-medicine. And insofar as Mussolini wanted to build a new Italian super race, represented, of course, by himself, or as the historian G.M. Trevelyan said, turn the Italians into second-rate Germans, he also, I think, wanted to improve the health of his population. Hitler declared in 1938 National Socialism, quoting, as a sober reality-based doctrine based on scientific knowledge. Some of the leading Nazis were militantly anti-Christian, and when its attempt to kind of synthesize Protestantism and Germanic racism, the Nazi regime turned against the churches too. So that's a huge contrast. Racial science was at the center of Nazi ideology. Enormous sums of money went into medical science. 50%, half of all university students in Germany were medical students by the time the war broke out. The medical profession had enormous prestige. The regime went to huge lengths to create a fit and healthy population. Almost everyone had to engage in gymnastics and other kinds of physical exercise every day. Perhaps it's a contrast that Hitler was pretty unfit and unhealthy, whereas Mussolini boasted, of course, of his machismo, of his physical prowess in all kinds of different ways. But both of them wanted to create a new type of human being. Obviously, of course, driving out Jewish scientists and oppositional scientists and encouraging pseudoscience, like racial hygiene, Aryan physics, and so on. The Nazi regime made things worse. And of course, there's the forced sterilization of hundreds of thousands of Germans, the murder of up to 200,000 supposed defectives, and experimentation that Paul has written about on living prisoners in the camps. But none of this undermines I think the point that the regime is obsessed with boosting health, although only, of course, of the racially approved so-called Aryan population, wanted to destroy the health and the lives of other racial groups, above all the Jews and also Slavs. So there's no kind of general fascist threat to health in my mind. And Of course, Trump has encouraged climate skepticism. He's been backed by evangelical Christians who rely on faith, not on reason. Trump casts doubt on the reality of the current pandemic. He's refused to listen to his medical advisors. He's promoted quack remedies, and Bolsonaro, you can say, much the same. And this is a kind of populism, right, on which scientists, educationalists, judges, other expert professionals are dismissed as part of the elites whose mission it is with the people and their chosen leader to destroy. And so therefore, of course, since Trump identifies himself with the people as kind of defined by himself, if he's not re-elected, it must be because the people have been treated. The problem is for health that, of course, that unlike Hitler and Mussolini, Trump and Bolsonaro have simply brushed aside science and medicine, above all, most importantly, in their climate change, climate crisis skepticism. This is, I think, the problem of the present, and that's something I think that you cannot say about real fascists. It's important, I think, therefore, to defend the institution of democracy and the neutrality and objectivity of the state, civil servants, judges, and scientific and medical advisors who can give informed and objective advice to politicians. I think there are huge differences with the Weimar Republic and Italy in the early 20s. Democratic institutions remain, as we've seen, relatively strong in the USA, at least compared to the very weakly, shallow-rooted democratic political culture of the Weimar Republic. The real problem, I think, lies in the proliferation of conspiracy theories, fake news, science skepticism, misinformation across the internet and social media. It's not, Trump hasn't rolled out hundreds of thousands of uniformed stormtroopers on the streets. He's waging war through the media. And that, I think, is where we have to focus on trying to defend the health of the population, not by rolling out the anti-fascist strategies of a century ago. So that's really what I wanted to say. Okay, it's okay.
Thank you very much. I mean, I just want to say we used fascist, but I mean, it was more a common substitute for totalitarian. But we can have the discussion later, and I appreciate very much.
I don't agree with the use of the totalitarian concept either.
Okay, all right.
You have to call them authoritarian populists and recognize there's something new, there's something different.
All right, okay. So, Paul, I mean, Richard just explained, the attitude of the Nazis toward the medicine. I mean, for the German. But I mean, we have to see that in a few years, public health, which was the leading public health in Europe, I mean, the public health of Max von Pettenkofer, of Robert Koch, I mean, really, the institutes of Munich and Berlin were the center of public health in Europe, and all over in very short time. This institution became an instrument to actually sterilize hundreds of thousands of people, kill them, implemented genocide of the Jewish and other populations in Germany. How did this happen?
Can I share my screen, please, Alfredo?
Please.
Show some slides.
Let me see if I can do that. Paul, I don't.
You should be able to do it now. Sorry.
Okay. I cannot make him co-chair.
No, Jennifer made him co-host, so he should be able to do it.
Okay, Paul, you can do it yourself.
I can do it myself. Okay, yeah, I'm clicking, but it doesn't work, but that's not so serious. I think, let me say, at a very, very basic level, in Nazi Germany, public health becomes racial health. You have a system whereby health offices become office for health, for race and inheritance. So I can share my screen and I can.
Yeah. Perfect. Great.
And I just wanted to show this as an introductory slide to bring the US close to Nazi Germany, because this is there was a virologist who called Eugen Hagen, and he trained in New York at the Rockefeller Yellow Fever Laboratories. And while in New York, he was active in the Bund, and he was very impressed by the populist, you could say, proto-fascist, proto-Nazi activism in New York. And he then comes back to conduct human experiments as a professor in the Reich University in Strasbourg, in the concentration camp nearby in Natzweiler on yellow fever and typhus. So I think he's an example of where the Koch tradition goes. If we look at the way these racial offices work, they target specific ethnic, racial, and physical groups. So one group that was targeted are the African German mixed race children of the Rhineland who were forcibly sterilized. Very little is known about them, very sad. Only one, Hans Hauk, who's pictured in the corner, is spoke up about his experiences when he was in the Hitler Youth, but then hauled off to be sterilized. A young patriotic German who did in the end join the German army. The other problem was that people were faced by public health controls, and this is universal. So if you were on the Kindertransport, you had to have a certificate that you were not educationally backward or mentally defective. And so you were bottled up in Germany through public health controls. Now, what happens, to answer Alfredo's question about the Pettenkofer tradition? The Pettenkofer tradition goes strongly into what's called geomedicine. Geomedicine was used in the Nazi efforts to not only to consolidate power within German communities, but also in the East and other occupied areas. This is from an epidemics atlas of Heinz Zeiss, who was professor of hygiene in Berlin. Here we see what happens to the Koch tradition. I've mentioned Hagen. This is another institution of the Waffen-SS, the Hygiene Institute of the Waffen-SS. You can see the ampules of typhus vaccine that were tested in the concentration camp of Buchenwald. These are the laboratory notebooks, said not to exist. They do exist. And I'm about to publish an edition of them. And what they show is that the lack of hesitancy is that the inhibitions, humane inhibitions, were removed, and so there were massive and deadly experiments in concentration camps on a really large scale. In Buchenwald, there are 729 victims whom I've identified, and 154 die tragically as a result of these typhus experiments. And we see hygiene operating very directly. Zyklon B, a pesticide being used in Auschwitz, and we see the way selections were occurring. Well-known Joseph Mengele, who was selecting for fitness to work, or for the majority straight to the straight to the gas chambers. He kept back a minority of twins. These are small, these are requests for bacteriological tests of twins. You can see Zwillinge, and these are for chemical and bacteriological tests. He names each twin, he gives them the camp number, and we have a date. And you can see a Wassermann, and on the other side, a Wassermann test, a Vidal-Felix test being done on another group of twins. And it's a way of identifying the twins through the Hygiene Institute in Auschwitz. And what we can see also is that although that I think Hitler and Himmler, they were ambivalent to medicine. They didn't want a professional group to have too much power on the one hand. On the other hand, they recognized that they needed medical technologies to execute their ideological aims. And we can see how there is an initiative on the medical side to conduct tests, and we can see the large increasing number of new medical tests, which increases rapidly as the war develops. Even in 1945, when the war is lost, there are new tests. All in all, I've identified 28,000 individual life histories of victims of Nazi medical experiments. So that one has to add as we have already mentioned, around 350,000 victims of sterilization, many not known, as we can see with the Rhineland children, and also those killed as a result of Nazi euthanasia killings of particularly of the mentally ill. And many of these are also not known, and their names are withheld much too long. And even if their names are withheld, there is still a great deal of secrecy, confidentiality, and really difficult, and I must say it is really difficult to research their life histories. And one result, and this is one result, is the amount of specimens which remain in Germany. Germany continued to use specimens collected during the war for research. So I'll give you a number of examples. These are brain slides from the Kaiser Wilhelm and later Max Planck Society. There were roughly 200 Jews whose brains were taken from Warsaw to Berlin in 1940. Here is one of the brains below, which we can, a slide which is still sitting in the Frankfurt Institute for Neurology. We can see other brain slides held by the Max Planck Society. We can see of Jews who were killed in the skeleton collection. We can see the stomach contents, and more honorably, the stomach contents and skin were buried of one of these Jewish skeleton collection victims. So we can see overall the tragic mass killings and genocidal killings which resulted from the unleashing of an uninhibited and democratically non-accountable, so coercive forms of medicine in Nazi Germany.
Thank you very much, Paul. Let me ask you one short question, because to my knowledge, most of this research didn't yield any useful results. And sometimes, like the research on typhus, which killed hundreds of or thousands of people, was using treatments that were absolutely non-scientific. And had Germany had found a treatment for typhus, maybe the course of the war would have been different. So what do you say about the efficiency of this medical research?
I absolutely agree with you. It is enormous resources are put into medical research with very little outcome, so that typhus is a very good example. The Allies used DDT. In the short term, very successful. for example, in Naples, and then in the occupation of Germany, really effective in the short term, because we know in the long term has toxic effects, whereas the Germans were obsessed with very laborious vaccine production and comparing the different effects of different sorts of vaccines in concentration camps, and absolutely ineffective. So as far as I can see, German medicine is a very rigid form of medical research. It was not effective in terms of producing a relevant medicine in order to either for the war in the end, or for the or to benefit the German population. So I think compared to the Allied medical research effort, penicillin is the outstanding example, DDT is another example. The Allies were much more flexible, they were much better at collaborating. The Germans are, these German professors, they are, how can I say, they are very vain, pedantic people. They're all the time infighting and competing with each other. So the tragedy is that for this immense loss of life that was caused, the actual benefits in terms of medical research are minimal. We can see a lot of specimens were collected. Yeah. Germany post-war is littered with these specimens, but it is not an effective medicine.
Thank you, Paul. Can you stop sharing your screen, and I'm going to now move to. Thank you.
I can do that.
There we are. All right. So now let me ask my next question to Mary. Hello, Mary. Nice to see you. And I should have mentioned that you write also in AJPH, not only.
I do. Although I was actually going to put something in the chat that was published in the Lancet. So.
Mary, now you've listened to Ruth, Richard, and Paul about those. Historical comparisons. When you have a very deep understanding of the situation in the United States by your experience, as health commissioner and now a professor of human rights. What is your feeling about whether there is a threat? Now, I don't dare saying a fascist threat, but let's say something authoritarian that would actually move into a control of the states and a destruction or paralyzing of our democratic institution. What's your feeling? How do you perceive the current situation in the United States?
Well, first, let me say that it's a real pleasure to be here, and it's really a pleasure to be on a panel with historians. I want to make clear that I am not a historian, although I got my first degree in history of science, and my tutor, as I guess you would call it in Britain, was Barbara Rosencrantz. So I've long had an interest in science. Since I've had this job, I've been, in science and in history, I've been reading more history than anything else. And I think historians have the advantage of something is finished and they can say what they want about it. And I think that we've gotten some of the clearest assessments from historians. But I think that without a doubt, what we saw on January 6th should be declared not just some sort of aberration, but a dangerous escalation of a movement assembled, encouraged, and generally revved up by the former president that was outside of all norms. I think that people have seen the images of people streaming into the Capitol as though they're going to a football match. I mean, they really were not, those images were not impeded. And then we saw later videos of them really engaged in what was practically hand-to-hand combat with some members of the Capitol Police, although they didn't defended very well. Today in the newspaper is a story about this unrelated incident, but relevant. I think this young kid, Kyle Rittenhouse, who was wandering around a demonstration in Kenosha, Wisconsin, with a long rifle, killing people, whose defense has been bolstered by many people making donations, not only as active members of the police force, but from their police department email addresses. So we have a police force which is potentially compromised by people who don't believe in democracy. So whether we call this fascism, and I think it's worth using those words because they should make us afraid, or whether we call it authoritarian populism, and I'll leave it to the historians to decide how important these distinctions are. I think that we have to recognize that that the United States came perilously close to the elected officials being placed in mortal danger. That didn't happen, and we have a different administration now, but that it could happen, it warrants the column that you've announced, Alfredo. But one thing that people haven't talked about is what I would consider the Achilles heel of US democracy, which is its treatment of its population of African descent. And relatedly, although it's now so small that it's not politically important, the genocidal campaigns that were waged against the people who were found here. Of course, the whole of Nazi medicine owes a great debt to race science as it evolved in the United States. In fact, I'm told by historians, and you all may know, may be able to validate this, that actually German ideologues looked to the United States for ways in which the laws were crafted. Sterilizations campaigns, of course, were carried out in the United States against people of African descent, and they continued. It was only in the 1970s, for example, that a campaign to sterilize Latino women in an eminent academic institution, University of Southern California in Los Angeles, was uncovered. All these women, without their knowledge and without legitimate consent, had been sterilized by physicians who thought they shouldn't have any more babies. So, we have a situation where a racist belief is not only taking a role in the fringes of medicine and public health. These were, esteemed people, as were the practitioners of Nazi medicine. These weren't a bunch of kooks. These were people in the mainstream. And we have that problem historically in the United States, and it's had a legacy that arguably allowed Mr. Trump to play on the dissatisfaction, which is real and should be real, of the lower middle class and working class whites, and build up racial animus, which framed government as basically an agent, not of the people, meaning them, but of a source of aid and succor to the Black population, which hasn't allowed an attack on the public sector that without these racist beliefs, I think, would not nearly be as resonant with much of the white population. Now, it's my hope that the white population in this country will see that the return on investment, so to speak, of their privilege is not that good. There are a lot of data to suggest the US is in real trouble. Life expectancy was going down before the Trump presidency. It started dipping down in 2015 and hasn't yet recovered. And because of COVID, the life expectancy decline will continue definitely for another year or two. That should worry all Americans. It wasn't only occurring among people who are classified as Black or Latinx. And so all to say that, that it seems to me that the medical and public health professions we haven't done a good enough job in making clear that the problem of racism in medicine isn't only the problem of Tuskegee or these atrocities, but it lies in our willingness to accept as normal, recurrent, and in some ways immutable, the racial inequities in health that we see. And those have created this notion that there are some people who just aren't as deserving of the full rights of citizenship, something that's gone on in the US now for 400 years. So, I think we're in a serious situation. And I think it's really correct to sound the alarm. And I hope that I've made clear that I don't think it just arose with one demagogic, autocratic, social media wielding, slightly unhinged president. There were a lot of problems that gave him the opportunity to be elected.
Thank you very much, Mary. I mean, the discussion now is open to the panel. I can continue asking questions, or we may have also a question from the public. If someone wants to intervene. Otherwise, let me ask. Yeah, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to follow up on what Mary said about January 6th also. The whole, I see Trump as, I see fascism as one of the first stages of authoritarianism, and I see Trump as an authoritarian in inclination. And what he actually did after he refused to recognize the election in those months, culminating with this coup attempt, January 6th, actually drew from all the eras of authoritarian history, because, first he kind of explored a military intervention of some sort, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff put an end to that. He came out with a declaration saying, it's General Millet, who said, the armed forces will only obey the Constitution and not an individual. And this was if you study coups, a third of my book is about coups. So there was a reason he said that. So that was kind of shut down. And then Trump, pursued this for these long months. And there's a reason other countries don't have such a long time before somebody's between being voted out of office and coming and the inauguration of somebody else, because there's a lot of mischief the wrong person can do. So he was trying electoral manipulation, and that's part of the playbook of 21st century autocrats. Erdogan does it, Putin does it. And, that didn't work either. And so he went for the nuclear option, and he tried this coup d'etat, which was an inside job as much as an outside job. And it was a symptom of the extremism is disseminated within the military, within the police, and all of these longstanding structural problems, and Mary was saying about this too, all came home to roost. But it was also a leader cult event, because that rally that he incited the violence, and this was at the issue of his impeachment, the incitement wasn't just telling them to stay strong and fight. The incitement was him also telling him that he loved them, because authoritarian leader-follower relationships are about people being made to feel special. They're included. So we told them, I love you, you're special, our journey is just beginning. And this evokes the fascist years, right? So Trump takes things from, I don't use the word fascist for him only because I like to keep, although he uses a lot of tactics like that, like the leader cult that come from fascism. I like to keep the word fascism for the one-party state, the dictatorship of the interwar. But it was a highly authoritarian shock event. It was a coup attempt. And it exposed, it's going to be a very long time before we can digest it. Yeah. And fully know what its effects will be.
Thank you, Ruth.
I had a question, Sir Richard.
Yeah.
I just wonder, I mean, about the subject of the cult of science under Nazi. Maybe, I mean, we've talked about it not yielding much useful scientific advance. So how do you think about that? And there is the whole idea that science is used for ideological purposes, that wasn't what it was about, science advancement. In the US, at least, there were diagnoses made that seemed bizarre in retrospect. A disease called drapetomania, which made enslaved people run away. That was a disease condition. It was treated with whipping. And, but these were not kooks that came up with this stuff. But it wasn't really about the diagnosis. It was about the whipping. So can you just unpack that a bit for us? It's hard for me to think of Hitler as pro-science.
Well, I mean, the starting point obviously is Brazil and the USA having these governments which clearly do not care about hundreds of thousands of their citizens dying from a pandemic disease. And I guess if some pandemic disease had hit Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, that would not have been the case. I think Hitler probably wouldn't have, he might have rationed medical care or vaccines and not had them given to the Jews or to minorities he disapproved of, like these unfortunate mixed race people Paul talked about. But I think there's a real contrast there between this anti-science, explicit disregard for science, and as I say, climate change is an even bigger thing than the pandemic. And you see the same kind of thing there. Now, I think Hitler was someone who respected science, but and if you look at the technological innovations that happened in Nazi Germany, jet engines, submarines with air conditioning, the V2 rocket, all kinds of things. They were building an atomic bomb, though they didn't in the end have the resources to make one. So it's a very scientific and technologically advanced culture, which Hitler and the Nazis wanted to take advantage of. I think Paul is absolutely right in saying that, of course, they didn't want these professions to get too powerful. They wanted to corral them and put them in the service of the state. And that, of course, produces a lot of difficulties. But medicine had huge prestige in Germany. If you look at those great discoveries and innovations of that wonderful period of bacteriology before the First World War, for example, not just Koch, but many of his disciples and students too. And that, I think, engendered a kind of arrogance in the medical profession, which ultimately found expression in the kind of things that Paul was talking about, which were, just to give you one example, there's Mengele thought his work in Auschwitz, his research work, was scientific. He was working on heterochromia, for example, the phenomenon of having two different eye colors. But the people he employed as assistants were all camp inmates, who were absolutely terrified of being executed if they didn't deliver the right kind of stuff. So what did? They took different colored eyes from different corpses and sent them to Mengele, telling him that they were from the same person. It's the conditions under which medicine, I think, existed. It's not just the arrogance of the medical profession, but
I wouldn't call that arrogance. I would say.
Well, no. I was going to say it's not just arrogance. It's also this complete disregard. The fact that you don't have controls, you don't have people telling you that what you're doing is scientifically wrong as well as morally wrong. And there's complete absence.
I would call it ideological, though.
You have to ask a question about what happened to medical ethics.
Yeah, that's absolutely
exactly
the point. because medicine without ethics, it doesn't seem to work. And there seems to be, a huge difference between the technological achievements of Nazi Germany, which you describe and are absolutely true, and the lack of achievement in terms of medicine, social science, everything that was under social and human sciences seems to have been a huge failure in Germany.
Richard. I don't know if Paul wants to come in here.
Okay.
I would very much agree with Alfredo that we have a medicine which vast resources are poured into medicine, elaborate research structures are constructed, and yet where do clinical tests take place? In concentration camps. It is absolutely unscrupulous, inhumane medicine, an extreme of inhumane medicine in Nazi Germany. I think, can one say that this is somehow implicit in all medical research? I would be very cautious about that. And I don't think that we can simply say this is unrestrained medicine. This is a sort of medicine which could have flourished under another sort of dictator. I think it is very specific to the racial ideological context of Nazi Germany. And doctors who actually support Nazi racial values. The views of somebody like Heinrich Himmler were really absolutely totally extreme in terms of interest in homeopathy, interest in all sorts of paranormal psychological phenomena. So this was not, you could use medicine, but he was not going to endorse unreservedly a conventional medical research. So I think the most cautious in terms of the achievements of Nazi Germany. Yes, Richard, in terms of engineering, I can see that V2 rockets, I can see that they were a success, but these are very limited successes because after all, strategically, the Allies managed the war a lot better in terms of resourcing, in terms of how you, the whole organization of the military.
Yeah.
I think what's also chilling is if you compare it to Mussolini in Italy, Mussolini much more positive eugenics, nutrition, welfare, support.
Not really.
Not really. You'd be critical.
Well, I think if you look at Nazi Germany, positive eugenics are a major effort there. Everyone has to do gymnastics, the housing reform, all kinds of things. It's a two-sided thing. I absolutely agree, Paul. I mean, with technological innovation, fantastic, but they didn't coordinate it, they didn't plan it, the resources were divided over far too many areas and so on. But nevertheless, I mean, what we're talking about here is Hitler's belief in possibilities of science. It comes in the end, of course, of this absurd propagandist thing of wonder weapons, at the end of the war, which is just a propaganda.
But one thing I want, it's very difficult, just like with the trains running on time and the supposed wheat production, it's really, really difficult to know what the heck went on, because these are regimes that fabricate statistics.
Yeah.
We don't really know like what exactly the output, you can count the number of tanks and rockets and things, but we don't know. It's all skewed by the veneer of propaganda and by fabricated statistics about effectiveness, about experiment outcomes, about everything. So we always have to remember that, and authoritarian regimes do their best, past and present, to make us forget that, for us to take their claims of efficiency, scientific, technological efficiency on face value, when you cannot. That's why when I wrote my book, I wanted to show how corruption, violence, propaganda, leader cult, they're all interrelated, and you cannot take one of them out of the other. So
So if I just say quickly, if you don't have a free press, you don't have independent media, everything is coordinated, it becomes very, very difficult for anybody to point a finger at violations of medical ethics, for example.
right.
Well, in our case, the press, I think, has done and continues to do a pretty good job. The conventional press, by which, in terms of reporting on the pandemic, when the president just wanted it to go away, reporting on the racial inequities emerging in mortality and hospitalizations, when his own the Centers for Disease Control weren't making the data available. I get all my data now from a private university website, and I read the newspapers, and it will take me a while to start going back to the CDC for this kind of information. He really succeeded in undermining our sense that government was a source of reality, but he did endorse the vaccine. I just wonder whether, because public health takes place at the intersection of society and science, whereas the vaccine was done in a lab. I mean, it was the United States that produced the first vaccines that were put into use. And it was Trump who came up with this, I think, sort of space age name for the effort, the Operation Warp Speed. That was science. I don't know. Does anybody want to...
Yeah. I mean, but there was also business. There was also
right.
Business.
It was also business.
And translated this science into public health was not exactly the strength of the past administration.
No, I mean, delivering the vaccinations was not his department.
Exactly. So, but there's one thing I'm really, afraid of, is that we start to, focus on the strong man and on this event of January 6th. But Ruth, I mean, weren't there elements that showed that, there were previous attempts on Capitol? It seems that there has been a rehearsal, and this was the most important one. But now they don't recognize the election, and for years from now, it still can happen. So, what do you think about this situation?
Yeah, no, we have a white extremism problem that from Oklahoma City forward. I just interviewed Malcolm Nance, who's a counterterrorism expert. He's often in the media for my newsletter, Lucid, and talked about how after Oklahoma City bombing, where you see the picture of the result, it looks like something most Americans had trouble even thinking that these things could happen here. It looked like Beirut, during the Civil War or something. And so there's been a difficulty to integrate the narrative that Americans are domestic terrorists. It's easier to blame Muslims or blame, for criminality, migrants, et cetera. That's always been the kind of thing. And so this was never taken care of. And Malcolm Nance was saying in the 1980s that the FBI was doing a lot of work at cleaning up white extremism. And then there was a lot of pushback from the right, and they kind of gave in to this pressure. And then, of course, under Trump, a truly disastrous thing happened. A lot of Trump, we're going to see when we start having more distanced appraisals. A lot of Trump's thing was about deregulating, including removing like, for example, white terrorism was removed from investigation. You weren't supposed to investigate it anymore. Only Muslim terrorism or Antifa. So we became much less safe in this regard, and extremists had much more range of motion. And he exceeded, in this regard. Even the neo-Nazis of Charlottesville were probably very surprised to hear the president of the United States saying they were very fine people. They probably never expected that gift. So January 6th and then we've never taken care of the anti-government subversives. These narratives, like they were trying to, if you come from other parts of the world, could be Europe, and you remember, kidnappings, or you lived under juntas, trying to kidnap the governor of Michigan and charging the state houses of these state capitals these are highly serious things that in other countries have a different narrative attached to them. And so we've been in this denial, the same denial with the health crisis of guns.
Absolutely. And so Richard, I mean, when I read you, you explained that in January 33, all of a sudden, there was this complicity between the police and the Nazis. And so people were either with them or against them, and rapidly they could impose a form of terror and neutralize a society which was extremely rich in terms of democracy, large parties, and so how do you explain that it went so fast? Because that's relevant for the United States. I mean, people think these guys, from January 6th, they can do much more, they're clowns, etc. But actually, if the same thing is repeated in several states, and I mean, can it be transformed rapidly?
There's a lot of differences. Okay, so first of all, you've got just a few years before, 1917, 1933, in 1917, you have Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which involves a civil war, it involves a Red Terror, the killing of thousands and thousands of moderate socialist middle-class people, the dispossession of the elites. I mean, a cataclysmic event. And so the middle classes in Germany were terrified of the Communist Party in Germany, which was very successful, a mass movement, 100 seats in the national legislature in the elections of November 1932. And their declared aim was to destroy democracy, in bourgeois democracy, as they called it in Germany, and impose a Stalinist dictatorship. So that's something that is, even if McCarthy tried to persuade Americans that was a threat, it is just completely trivial, as they usually say. That most members of the Communist Party in America in the 50s were actually FBI agents. So that's a wholly different order of crisis. Then another different order of crisis is the fantastic depth of the Depression. At least 35% unemployment, 3-4 years of bankruptcies, bank failures, just a really, really catastrophic economic depression. We've seen with a relatively mild economic depression from 2008 to 9, that's a big factor in sparking a lot of populist movements, a lot of discontent with government, a lot of political change, but it's vastly greater in 1932-33. And then you have Weimar democracy, as I said, has very shallow roots, okay? It's not the Constitution is in 1919. It wasn't in 1776 or 1800 or whatever. It was a new constitution, which most Germans disapproved of Weimar democracy. After the initial couple of elections, most of the political parties were opposed. I mean, the majority of votes went to political parties who were opposed to the Weimar Constitution. And as I said, if you've got also from 1930-33, the Reichstag, the national legislature was paralyzed because you just have uniformed communist deputies and Nazi deputies just shouting at each other and blocking every piece of legislation. So by 1932, the legislature only met a handful of times in 1932 because it couldn't achieve anything at all. So you already have rule by decree. So the past is already sold by the time Hitler was appointed chancellor. And he proceeds by two kind of twin track approach. It's mass violence on the streets on the one hand, again, hundreds of thousands of uniformed armed stormtroopers, and pseudo-legal measures like the Reichstag Fire Decree and the Enabling Act on the other, and then various kinds of blackmail, threats. The army, small but effective and well-disciplined, that's brought around to favor an authoritarian dictatorship. I don't think they quite knew what they were getting themselves into, but by the time they did, it was too late. So there are many, many reasons why America in 2021 is not Germany in 1933. That's not to underestimate the threat to American democracy by from the hard right, the armed right, and the events of the 6th of January. I don't myself think that was a coup attempt. I think it was too disorganized. Too is pathetic, really. Actually, it's just a bunch of thugs storming the Capitol building. If you read Edward Luttbach's recipe book for how to carry out a coup, that's not how you do it. You have to. Hitler managed to do it because he had the support of most of the business community, the army, as you said, the police force, and the civil service. And he failed in the coup attempt in 1923, the beer hall putsch, because he didn't get the support of those people in Bavaria, and those institutions defended the Bavarian constitution and political system. So he made sure to do that in 1933.
All right. We have many questions that are very specific from the public, so I didn't know how to bring them. And one is a terrific question about, Stalin's Soviet Union and relationship to science. I would like to have you again for a discussion on that, which would be really interesting. It's not a simple answer in my view, but we're getting to the end of this panel. We have 4 more minutes. Let me ask you, I would like to give you, Mary, the last word, but let me ask if Paul, Richard, or Ruth wants to say a last word before I give it to Mary. Paul.
Oh, I think listening to our discussions, I think Richard was too hard on the on the Communist Party, because after all, many people became communist in order to oppose fascism.
Certainly true.
That
yeah.
was, I mean, because they felt that strong measures are absolutely necessary. So I think I would be more comprehending with the strength of the KPD in Germany. I think the other thing is that one is the ambivalence of Hitler, Himmler, and the Nazi dictatorship to science. I think it's there is a lot of fraught negotiation going on between between medicine, public health, and dictators. They have got different aims, and they're speaking a little bit across each other, and maybe that should be brought into our picture.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, just really quickly. I mean, I take those points. There's some very interesting comments here, questions. One person says, science is never objective. The erroneous assumption that science is objective is what leads to the scientific skepticism that gives rise to Trump. I mean, I can see what they're trying to say, but I don't really agree with that. There is a terrible pandemic that is killing millions of people across the world. We know more or less how to reduce its impact, and that is what I would call objective science. Similarly, we know the world is heating up at an incredible rate. It's vastly damaging, and the main cause is human activity. That also is objective science. And I think that the denial of the possibility of objective knowledge is one of the things that is fueling skepticism about these things. And I think that's very unfortunate.
Thank you, Richard. Ruth. You've muted, yeah.
In the chat, Ingrid had said, what would an anti-authoritarian, approach to public health look like? And first of all, building on what Richard was saying and others, clear, politics of transparency and accountability, both in communications and in policy, but at its very root, a politics of care. And which it's not just Trump, the GOP, all the neoliberal, let them starve, let the Darwinian, social Darwin stuff. All of this is not a politics of care. And we don't have any social safety net, and we have a very strange attitude toward the politics of care and social net in our country in particular. And so that too is because what authoritarian is despising the people you govern, exploiting them, plundering them, and leaving them, like Mussolini said, they don't need to eat. I'm glad we've been poor because it means they're used to not eating. Or Trump saying, when somebody told Trump the new rising figures of coronavirus deaths, this chilled me to the bone. He said, "It is what it is." Yeah. And that statement encapsulates a history of authoritarianism. It is what it is. Don't have any hope. Don't look to the future. Just accept what I tell you, submit, and starve or die. And that's the opposite of the politics of care.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Mary, so next 4 years.
Well, I mean, I want to say one thing. I want to thank Sir Richard for raising climate change, which we didn't engage with much. But and note that whoever said that science is not objective, that I also would not agree with that. I think it's not neutral, and that's a distinction with a difference. Subjective means that it can be replicated. And I do believe that there is such a thing as a scientific method. The next 4 years, we have 74 million people who, continue to be entranced by Mr. Trump. So we have a new administration, but we still have what I would consider the fertile ground that enabled a demagogic authoritarian leader like him to emerge. I wanted to ask Ruth if him being off Twitter will help us all. I suspect it will, but it certainly makes for a more peaceful daily life for someone like me. But I believe that we have to tackle the structural issues, and that I think, at least my field, public health, has not been clear enough. And if we start thinking about the answer to COVID is just delivery of a vaccine, we will miss what made us so vulnerable in the first place. And that has to do with the politics that all my fellow panelists have discussed, as well as you, Alfredo. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. No, it was fantastic. I mean, please join me. You are on Zoom, and there are people on YouTube following this panel. Join me to thank this fantastic group of persons, beautiful personalities, great scientists. It's been my great honor to have this discussion with you. And again, thank you very much for your time and for sharing these ideas. I hope we'll stay in touch.
Thank you so much, Alfredo, and to all of our panelists today, both this panel and earlier. Thank you also to Jennifer for a really terrific conference. I hope the conversation will continue, and really appreciate you've all given us so much to think about. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Just really wonderful. Thank you so much to the law review team, Andrew Farrington, the editor-in-chief, who joined us, Dylan O'Sullivan, Summer Brown, and Aidan Collane, who are the executive articles editors who helped select and will help actually edit the papers that will be published next year, so stay tuned. Thank you to the American Journal of Public Health and Alfredo Moravia, all of our speakers and commentators, our amazing student volunteers, Nadia Halder and Fenor Nee Coughlin, and Siobhan Fanning, who was helping to run things on the back end with the live streaming. Thanks to everyone. Please visit our conference webpage. We are going to post the recording and any related materials that speakers are interested in sharing. Thank you so much.